Journalist, historian, soldier, painter, he was also one of the greatest leaders of our time. His name was Winston Churchill, and he rallied a nation in its darkest hour. I'm Peter Graves, and this is Biography. Winston Churchill has been called the last truly great man of the Western world. His record of wartime heroism and peacetime leadership may never be equaled. But few people remember his early days, his strange, checkered career before his brush with greatness. Right from the beginning, young Winston was a poor student, and one of his teachers called him the naughtiest small boy in the world. As he grew up and became a politician, Churchill had so many failures, his opponents acidly called him a man with a brilliant future behind him. And yet each time his political career went down in flames, he pulled himself out of the ashes and began again. His story is a testament of endurance. Join us now for our special four-part series on Winston Churchill, narrated by his official biographer, Martin Gilbert. Now, Churchill, the maverick politician.
Churchill was born into the privileged world of the British aristocracy. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was the youngest son of the Duke of Marlborough. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was the lively daughter of an American financier.
When his mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, was 7.5 months pregnant, she was staying here at Blenheim Palace. One day she joined the shooting party. While out with the shooters, she had a fall and labour pains came on. She was rushed back to the palace over the rough ground in a pony trap. So it was that Winston Churchill spent the first of his 90 Christmases here at Blenheim Palace. Here, too, he was baptized in the palace chapel shortly after Christmas of 1874. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill.
Churchill's childhood followed the pattern of an upper-class British family. He was brought up by a nanny, and when he was 7, his mother sent him to boarding school. At 13, he went to Harrow. At Harrow, Churchill showed promise in the subjects he loved, history and English among them. He excelled in fencing, winning the public schools championship. In later life, he would joke about his lack of success at exams.
As life unfolded, I've been astonished to find how many more degrees I have received than I passed examinations.
Churchill was a lonely schoolboy. His parents were often too busy with their social life to bother with their son.
If you have not time to write, you might telegraph. That takes very little time. Please, darling Mummy, do write to your loving son. Darling Mummy, do attend to my letter. I am so wretched. Even now I weep. Please, my darling Mummy, be kind to your loving son. Please, do come to your loving son. Winston S. Churchill.
Even on speech day, Churchill's parents failed to come and see him. He missed their love. Instead, he poured out his troubles to his beloved nanny, Mrs. Everest. He called her womany. When she came to see him in her nanny's clothes, young Winston proudly showed her round the school, braving the comments of his schoolmates.
I remember once at the end of long summer holidays, I think I was 16 or 17, I was going back to Eton. And the last night we sat up late talking in his study at Churchill, and we talked of many things. I think at 1 or 1:30 in the morning, and he said, "You know, dear boy, I think I've talked to you more these holidays than my father talked to me in the whole of his life." And there was no bitterness in it, but there was sadness.
After Harrow, Churchill applied for Sandhurst to train as a soldier. When, after the third attempt, he finally succeeded, his father warned his son,
I am certain that if you cannot prevent yourself from leading the idle, useless, unprofitable life you have had during your school days, you will become a mere social wastrel, one of the hundreds of public school failures, and you will degenerate into a shabby and futile existence.
When he got to Sandhurst, he found that his physique was a great disadvantage. He wrote to his mother and said, I am cursed with so feeble a body. And indeed, he was only 5'6", and he was only 31 inches round the chest. He was hairless, and he felt very inferior physically, I think.
Churchill spent the next 4 years as a regular soldier, fighting in India and the Sudan. He called this period the university of his life. He read, wrote newspaper articles, and at 23 published his first book, a graphic account of the war on the northwest frontier. In 1899, Churchill's search for action and adventure took him to South Africa to report on the Boer War. His articles warned the British public that in their fight for independence, the Boers were a formidable force, masters of the art of surprise. He was soon to experience this for himself.
On the 15th of November 1899, an armoured train with 150 British soldiers on board set off on patrol along this railway line. Churchill had been invited to join them. At first he'd been reluctant to do so, thinking that it would be a routine patrol with nothing new to report, but the commanding officer had persuaded him to go. It was to be one of the most fateful days of Churchill's life.
The armoured train was ambushed and derailed by the Boers. During the attack that followed, Churchill took command, clearing the line so that the engine, with him on board, got away, taking 60 men, many of them wounded, to safety. Churchill returned to help the troops still fighting on the line, but was captured before he could reach them. He was taken prisoner, despite his protest that he was a war correspondent and not a soldier. When the press wrote about his exploits, he became an immediate hero. He was held prisoner in this building in Pretoria.
I hated every minute of my captivity more than I have hated any other period in my whole life. Great events were in progress. Fine opportunities for action and adventure were slipping away.
After 3 weeks in captivity, Churchill escaped over the prison wall and jumped a train. Young man, fair-haired, moustache, with a lisp, the description went out. Wanted, dead or alive. He hid in a mine, surrounded by Boer forces, and finally escaped again by train. The newspapers speculated on his whereabouts. Eventually he appeared in Durban. Here he told an enthusiastic crowd of his daring exploits. An article, How I Escaped from the Boers, promptly followed, then a book. In the autumn of 1900, with the war over, Churchill presented himself for election as the Conservative candidate for Oldham. The 26-year-old hero won by a narrow majority, helped by his mother.
She was proud, and she saw his name in the papers, and well-known people praised what he was doing, and so naturally she took a great maternal pride, and she got on the bandwagon in a big way, and did a great deal to help him. As he says of her, she left no string unpulled, she left no cutlet uncooked. That would assist him in his career.
Churchill soon emerged as a rising star of the Tory party.
Somewhat heavy-looking, ambitious, hard-working, with a touch of mysticism that attracts the mob, a born orator with power to move people as he wills, Winston Spencer Churchill must go far.
But to Churchill's agile mind, his fellow Tories were, as he told his mother, sleepy, exhausted and played out. He attacked government policy, particularly on trade. The Tories wanted to tax goods imported from outside the empire. He wanted free trade. In 1904, now hated by the Tories, he joined the Liberals.
He was regarded as a renegade and a turncoat by a great body of political opinion. Also, at that time, my father was regarded as being fairly sort of bumptious and insufferable.
He was not really a party man, and indeed he had a certain contempt for all political parties. And I remember him saying, you need a charger to carry you into battle, and you must take the most convenient hack in the stable and point it the direction you want it to go.
The charger Churchill took from the stable was the Liberal party of Mr. Asquith. At the age of 30, he was appointed Under-Secretary for the Colonies, his first ministerial post. 3 years later, aged 33, he became one of the youngest cabinet ministers ever. As president of the Board of Trade, he introduced many social reforms. He abolished sweated labour, set up labour exchanges for the unemployed, legislated for a minimum wage with compulsory meal breaks at work. The British owe their tea breaks to Churchill, but he was more successful at politics than love.
The great loves of his life until he met my mother were, first of all, Pamela Lytton. Then there was Muriel Wilson, who later became Mrs. Ward. She was a tremendous beauty, and he did propose to her. And, of course, he was very much in love at one time with Ethel Barrymore, and he proposed to her.
But she refused him too. As an actress, she was not amused by the world of politics. Soon he was to meet a young woman who was interested in his political world, the daughter of an impoverished but aristocratic Liberal family, Clementine Hosier. Their first meeting was not a success.
My mother told me that she felt extremely uncomfortable with this man just standing there gazing at her. And he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything. So she saw, standing not far away, a beau of hers. So she sort of made a little sign. And the man came up and said, "Oh, will you dance with me?" So she took her exit very quickly and thankfully. And as the beau swept her off, he said to her, "Whatever were you doing talking to that frightful cad, Winston Churchill?"
Churchill, cabinet minister, author, and eligible bachelor, did not see his Clementine again after their first awkward meeting for another 4 years, until they met by chance at a dinner party. A few weeks later, at Churchill's request, she was invited with him to Blenheim Palace to spend the weekend as a guest of Churchill's cousin, the Duke of Marlborough. Churchill had decided that he wanted to marry Clementine, and that Blenheim Palace, his birthplace and the home of his ancestors, was the right place to propose. The weekend was almost over, however, and Churchill had not found the courage to say anything.
And at this point, Winston's cousin, the Duke, who'd been observing all this, took things into his own hands. My mother came down to breakfast quite early. She was an early riser. And the Duke went upstairs. My father was in bed reading the newspapers, I imagine, and he gave him a piece of his mind. I imagine it was to the effect that if you want to marry this beautiful girl, you better get out of bed, get dressed, go down there and propose to her.
It was on the 11th of August 1908 that Churchill finally plucked up courage to invite Clementine Hosier to walk with him in the grounds at Blenheim Palace. While they were walking, it came on to rain, so they took shelter here in the Temple of Diana. And while inside the temple, Churchill nervously asked her to marry him. She accepted. They decided to keep the news of their engagement secret until she could go to London and tell her mother. But as they emerged from the temple, Churchill suddenly saw his closest friend, rushed up to him, embraced him, and in full sight of several palace servants, blurted out the news. So the secret was out.
A month later, they were married at St. Margaret's, Westminster. She was 23. He was 10 years older. In January 1911, 3 policemen were killed by armed burglars, who were then trapped in Sydney Street in the East End of London. Now Home Secretary, Churchill arrived to take personal charge of what seemed like a military operation in a London street.
And I could see a man with a tall top hat and a long black coat standing there. I didn't know who he was. I was 9 years old at the time. I didn't know who he was, but he was standing there surrounded by people. But it wasn't until after the siege, and the papers were full of it, we realised who he was that had been standing across the road there.
A company of Scots Guards and horse artillery were brought in. Churchill was to be much criticised by press, Parliament and the public for risking his own life and conducting operations there as Home Secretary. After a 10-hour siege, the house caught fire and the burglars died in the burning building. Churchill had greater problems with the suffragettes. He supported the view of the Liberal government that women did not need the vote, but as Home Secretary, the issue for him was not so much votes, but the maintenance of law and order. The worst incident between police and suffragettes was a running 6-hour battle in Parliament Square. Churchill was blamed by the suffragettes for their harsh treatment by the police.
When he was questioned about it, first he said that the police had misunderstood his instructions. Later, a week later, he told the House of Commons that no instructions had been given, either verbal or in writing. Indeed, there was a complete cover-up. My mother always felt that Churchill was an ambitious politician whose behaviour was less than honest.
Churchill became hated by the suffragettes. After he had opposed them in the House of Commons, he was physically attacked.
On one occasion, one of them tried to throw my father under a train which was arriving at the station. It was fended off by my mother, who hit her hard with an umbrella.
Churchill warned the cabinet that if they gave the vote to women, they would perish at a woman's hand.
My father was not in favour of votes for women, not till very much later, with a good deal of candour. He remarked that he would have been more in favour of them having the vote when he realised how many of them subsequently voted for him.
In 1911, Churchill was finally given the cabinet post that most suited his love of military affairs, First Lord of the Admiralty. It was my golden age, he later wrote. He fought his corner hard to ensure that the Royal Navy would be strong enough to deter the growing menace of the German fleet. In the summer of 1914, people's thoughts were far from war. Churchill was prepared.
Everything tends towards catastrophe and collapse. I am interested, geared up and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that? The preparations have a hideous fascination for me.
The war, which everyone believed would be over by Christmas, became a bloody stalemate on the Western Front. To break the deadlock, Churchill proposed a naval attack through the Dardanelles against Germany's ally Turkey, to his colleague Lloyd George.
Winston said to Elgee, "If I can force the Dardanelles by the British Navy, I shall be the greatest man in Europe." Lloyd George was in favour of it, provided always that it was a combined operation with Kitchener at the War Office and the Navy. Winston was impetuous and wanted it to be alone.
To Churchill and his admirals, it seemed almost a simple plan to send British warships through this narrow strip of water to Constantinople and victory over the Turks. For the British admirals and for Churchill, the firepower of the British battleships seemed sufficient first to blast and then to push past the Turkish forts. The British cabinet in London were excited by the prospect of a series of magnificent victories, which would follow this single naval success.
Kitchener was unwilling to send troops to Turkey immediately. Churchill persuaded the cabinet that the navy should go it alone. When the British and French launched their assault on the Dardanelles, bombarding the Turkish forts, 6 Allied ships were sunk or disabled by hidden mines. The British admiral in command called off the attack. Churchill urged a renewed assault, but the cabinet had lost faith in his judgment that the navy alone would succeed. In May 1915, he was removed from the Admiralty. Kitchener poured troops into the Dardanelles, but after 6 months and the death of more than 100,000 men, the British withdrew. Churchill was blamed for this costly and bloody campaign. Not only had his naval attack failed, many believed it had only served to warn the Turks of British intentions.
There's no doubt that Churchill's attempt in January was in effect sending the Turks a postcard that we're coming along in some weeks' time. He wanted something done yesterday that should have been, he should have waited. Impatience, impulsiveness. It was a very good idea, but a king-size cock-up. And a lot of lives wasted in a useless endeavour.
My mother thought that the Dardanelles marked the absolute nadir of his political fortunes, and that it had a deep effect upon him. And she said, I thought he would die of grief.
Cold-shouldered by his colleagues, Churchill decided to fight as a soldier on the Western Front. On the day of his departure, Clementine wrote,
There was a thick fog, and the figure was misty and dim. I feel you receding into the fog and mud of Flanders, and not coming back for so long.
The ex-cabinet minister was now Lieutenant Colonel, commanding the 6th Battalion, Royal Scots Fusiliers. The disaster of the Dardanelles made him less than welcome at the front.
Everybody was saying, why does Winston Churchill, a cabinet minister, not go to some other battalion? We don't want him here. We've got a good commanding officer here. Well, the mere fact that he come back with the shadow of the Dardanelles over him, they had a very poor opinion of him.
Churchill established his headquarters in this farm in Belgium, at a little village called Plugsteert, Plug Street to the soldiers, only a few hundred yards behind the front line. He was not afraid of sharing danger with his men, and would often go on patrol close to the German lines.
I took Winston Churchill up over the top of the parapet into no man's land, and whenever we got to a certain hole in front of the German barbed wire, we would crawl into it, and we'd lie there up to here in water, listening to the Germans stalking, and I heard them stamping their feet on the duckboards to warm their feet.
Churchill's men quickly grew to like him. He shared their hardships and their moments of relaxation.
Winston Churchill was the world's most horrible singer, and he started to sing My Old Tarpaulin Jacket, and it was terrible, and the boys would clap him, and they were as pleased as could be. He was a real man's a man.
Wrap me up in me tarpaulin jacket, and say a poor buffer lies low. Get 6 stalwart lancers to carry me, with steps mournful, solemn and slow.
Churchill became depressed and angry at the slaughter. Clementine was his one comfort.
My dearest one, I have your little photograph up to my lips now, and I kiss it each night before I go to bed. What should I do if I had not you to write to when I am despondent?
After 6 months in France, Churchill had returned to Britain. He spent a further year in the political wilderness until his friend Lloyd George, now Prime Minister, brought him back to the cabinet, despite Conservative opposition. In 1919, as Secretary of State for War, he was plunged into the problems of Ireland. In their fight for an independent Ireland, the newly formed IRA were attacking the British Army. Outraged by IRA atrocities, Churchill sent in a volunteer regiment, the Black and Tans, to crush the rebellion. The Black and Tans were notorious for their cruelty.
They used to resort to methods like indiscriminate firing from lorries, shooting children, trailing men, captured men behind them, so that bits of them were found all over the roadway after the lorries had passed. They burnt villages, they burnt homes, they burnt towns.
They committed atrocities against the Irish people. They were inclined to take out all their frustrations on the ordinary people. And the Irish people held Churchill responsible for that.
In Britain, too, Churchill was criticised for the government's harsh measures. Even Clementine reproached him.
It always makes me unhappy and disappointed when I see you inclined to take for granted that the rough, iron-fisted, Hunnish way will prevail.
Churchill soon realised that force was not working. A political agreement would have to be negotiated. Michael Collins, military leader of the IRA, came to London to discuss an Anglo-Irish treaty. Churchill took a firm line.
That in the final days of the negotiating of the treaty, that there was absolutely no doubt in Collins's mind and in other members of the negotiating team that Churchill threatened an all-out war.
And Churchill was using phrases like real war, not mere bushranging. We'll drive, and that implied concentration camps. It implied aerial bombardment and the full rigour of the British Army.
So the Irish Treaty was signed, and Collins posed with King and Cabinet. The treaty made Southern Ireland the Irish Free State. It excluded Ulster, the predominantly Protestant counties of the north, which remained part of the United Kingdom. Collins wrote gratefully to Churchill, "We couldn't have done it without you," and British troops left Ireland. But the treaty was rejected by many Irish Republicans. Within 6 months, Collins was assassinated. Ireland sank into civil war. In 1924, the Conservatives won the election. Baldwin, the new Prime Minister, invited Churchill to rejoin the government. He was now to change parties a second time, from Liberal back to Conservative.
He had many, many enemies in the ranks of the Conservative Party who refused to accept that Churchill could be trusted in any way. And he was utterly amazed, and as he put it, the Conservative Party dumbfounded when Mr. Baldwin invited him to become Chancellor of the Exchequer. He used to say, of course, anyone can rat, but it takes talent to re-rat.
Don't go down in the mind, and dreams very often come true. Daddy, you know it would break my heart if anything happened to you.
A crisis had arisen in the coal industry. The mine owners were demanding an immediate cut in wages. The miners refused and were locked out by the owners.
The 26 strike was about half an hour on the day and 10% off the pay. And the miners' leader of the day, A.J. Cook, famous saying was not a minute on the day, not a penny off the pay.
To support the miners, the trade unions called a general strike. The government called in volunteers to run the transport system and to help break the strike. To Churchill and the government, a halt to all work posed the threat of anarchy.
Churchill was Chancellor of the Exchequer. 25 years earlier, he had been a journalist. Now the cabinet asked him to take charge of a government news sheet, but he decided to go one better and to produce a newspaper. He did so. It was called the British Gazette, and within a week had reached the incredible circulation of 3 million copies. Churchill and his newspaper were outspoken. If the general strike were to succeed, he said, the trade union leaders would become masters of the nation. Either the country will succeed in breaking the general strike, or the general strike will break the country.
Well, of course, Churchill blamed the miners for the strike. He thought it was the hotheads that had got to work, and ignoring altogether the demands that had been made on them by the coal owners. And, well, as far as Churchill was concerned, he didn't care tuppence for any of the working class. He'd never experienced the conditions that they lived under, and he'd no idea what they was like.
Without pay, many mining families were on the verge of starvation.
My personal opinions about Churchill was, say, there was a lot more people. I'm not a vindictive person, but at that time I thought that him and Baldwin, for that matter, would have been better dead because the country would have been a better place.
Churchill believed the general strike would have to be broken before a settlement could be reached. He advised the Prime Minister, tonight surrender, tomorrow magnanimity.
Churchill's whole attitude to life, you know, was to beat you down. And then, after he had conceded, tired, weak, nothing to offer, he'd want to talk to you.
This is London calling the British Isles. We have just received the news that the general strike has been called off by the leaders of the Trades Union Council.
Churchill, as editor of the British Gazette, was thought by the miners to be the villain of the piece.
I wrote a letter to Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I said I was very sorry, but I couldn't see the miners being left to struggle on and ultimately conquered by starvation and cold. And Churchill wrote me a long letter back and said, come and see me. And I'd like to talk to you about this. So I did. And it's the first time I'd ever met Churchill. And I went into his room at the Treasury, and he said, I understand your pangs and anxieties. And he said, as a matter of fact, I'm on your side. I can't say so as a member of the Cabinet, but I wanted to give them a very generous settlement, and I got within sight of it. But I wasn't allowed to by the Cabinet.
Churchill remained Chancellor for 5 years. He introduced pensions for widows and orphans and reduced taxes for the poor. Lloyd George called him the merriest tax collector since Robin Hood. But he failed to revive the economy or to reduce unemployment as he had hoped.
He was a complete fish out of water, Churchill, at the Treasury, and he'd come out of a conference of high experts and economists and bankers, which he loathed. And I said, what happened? And he looked at me rather sadly and he said, you know, I wish these fellows were admirals or generals. I talk their language and I can make them understand what I say and often make them do what I want. But after a time, these bankers and economists start talking Persian, and then I'm sunk.
Ramsay MacDonald led Labour to victory in the 1929 general election. 2 years later, MacDonald formed a national government with Conservatives and Liberals, but there was no place for Churchill. He was disliked by the Tories, particularly because he opposed their plans to give self-government to India, in his view, still the foundation of British imperial power. Outspoken, controversial, always the outsider, he seemed now to have no political future. A humble backbencher, he was to be out of office for 10 years. Churchill had lost a small fortune in the Wall Street crash. Now he came to the States, in the grip of the Depression, to earn money by lecturing.
I'm going to talk about this economic problem, which ought to cause us all continuous thought. It is surely a great mystery that we should all be so much poorer now than we were 2 or 3 years ago. Why should the whole world suddenly have got so much poorer?
These attempts to offer a solution to the economic problems were unexpectedly interrupted.
Churchill had been invited to a house on Fifth Avenue to meet some friends. His taxi searched for an hour in vain to find the house. Agitated, Churchill got out of the taxi and began to walk. Being English, he looked the wrong way. Suddenly, he was struck by a car, falling to the ground and lying here in the street. He was badly hurt, bleeding both from the head and from the legs.
Churchill spent a week in hospital. "I certainly suffered every pang, mental and physical," he wrote, "but there is neither the time nor the strength for self-pity. Live dangerously, dread naught, all will be well."
After a few days, he sat up in bed and he dictated a really quite a wonderful article on how it feels to be knocked down by a car. He sold it for a much-needed $5,000.
I had a hard bump. Harder bump, I think, than most people would like to take. However, here I am. And I hope I'm going to have better luck this time. I feel very much better.
Bound for a well-earned rest in the Bahamas, Winston Churchill cheerfully faces the demon cameramen on leaving his hotel.
That's the stuff to give him.
Mr. Churchill, great British statesman, is almost fully recovered from his encounter with a New York taxicab.
Churchill continued his lecture tour. His new secretary came to know him better.
But he was really the most unself-conscious person I've ever met. He never seemed to care what anyone else thought of him. I can remember one instance of that. He was undressing for dinner, and meanwhile, of course, dictating to me. I watched with some apprehension as he shed first his coat and his tie, his collar, and then he began to loosen his braces, which held his trousers up. Well, I realized that he was absolutely wrapped up in what he was dictating and really didn't even know I was there. But when it came to really letting his trousers down, I rose to my feet and I said very firmly, "Mr. Churchill." And I saw a startled look come over his face, and he pulled his trousers up and he said, "Oh, dear, I do apologize. But you know, don't you, that when I've got an idea in my mind, I simply am not aware of anything that's going on around me." I very soon realized that as a secretary, I was no more to him than a fountain pen that required no time to eat or time to rest. I was on the go perpetually. Often I wouldn't have time to eat, and I'd suddenly, late in the afternoon, realize that I needed some food. So I'd snatch a cup of coffee and a sandwich and then go on, sometimes till 2 or 3 in the morning. He was a terribly inconsiderate man. In fact, I've never known anyone who was so inconsiderate. And it wasn't that he was cruel, but he was so involved in his own wishes, his own desires to get the work done, that he never thought about the person who had to do it.
Chartwell in Kent was the family home for Clementine and their 4 children. Churchill had bought it on impulse, against the wishes of his wife.
She thought she talked him out of it. But while my mother was in bed, recovering from my birth, he swept the other 3 children up and brought them all down here for a day expedition. And of course they fell in love with it too. And then he said to them, "Well, isn't it wonderful, because I've just bought it."
She was afraid of what it was all going to cost. This large house with 82 acres, which would all need upkeep. The house would need 14 servants at least, which would need upkeep. It was a constant worry to her. He would say, "Oh, don't worry about trifles. It's all right," and dismiss it easily.
He always used to say, "A day spent away from Churchill is a day wasted." He wrote here, he worked here, he played here. I mean, he made those lakes. He made the dam there in the distance and made first one lake and then 2 lakes, and then he built the swimming pool. And then he started building walls, and that red brick wall was built very largely by him.
Clementine was the perfect wife to deal with Churchill's restless energy.
I was always astonished what a good marriage it was, in spite of the fact that he was a terribly demanding man. It seemed to me that Clemmy had worked out a way of managing him. He always rushed off to her with any new idea he had and to ask her opinion. And she never hesitated to say if she liked it or if she didn't. And very often they'd have a rather heated argument about it. And he afterwards would say, you know, she's my pussycat. She spits at me.
Well, they always wrote to each other, you know. It was the era of, though under the same roof, write notes or letters once or twice a day. And she would, if she thought he'd been something at a dinner table she did not approve of, she would write him a little note and make him aware of it.
They never shared a bedroom. They had quite separate rooms, and it was explained to me that Mrs. Churchill liked to go to bed fairly early, whereas he would stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning. Churchill only shared her room when he got a written invitation.
From Chartwell, working with a team of researchers, Churchill wrote at this desk his 4-volume biography of his ancestor, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. The book was to earn him over £500,000. He also began his epic history of the English-speaking peoples.
I've written a very great many books. I think by the time I was 25 years old, I'd written as many books as Moses.
Churchill needed to earn large sums of money to support the lifestyle he and his family expected.
His daughter, Diana, came in one morning with a handful of bills, and she said, look at these wretched things. They've been following me about for a year, and you know I can't possibly pay them. I said, looking at them and noticing how many famous stores, the names were on these bills, I said, well, how on earth did you run these bills up? Oh, she said, you know, if you're a Churchill, you can always get credit. Why, Randolph bought a Rolls-Royce on credit. He drove it home, and Papa saw it. He said, you take that right back. And he made him do it.
Churchill loved the sun. He loved the water. Here in the south of France, where so many of his close personal friends had villas, he came 2 or 3 times a year, not only to write and to paint, but also to ponder the international situation and the whole troubled future of Europe. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. While the rest of Europe was disarming, the Nazis were rearming fast. In 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, where no German troops were allowed. Britain took no action. At Chartwell, Churchill received secret information about Germany's future intentions. One informant was a friend in the Foreign Office.
But there was a very highly paid official who fed him accurate information, and which, of course, was contrary to what was strictly proper. But it was, in fact, the case that Winston was in the possession of very much more accurate information than was available to the public.
Churchill made use of this secret information to urge Britain to rearm, but the government was for appeasement, and few took him or his warnings seriously.
Well, I'm afraid I was one of those foolish people who agreed with the writing of. And I used to see him in the old Carlton Club. In that club, we went in through a great big hall where people sat having drinks and so on before lunch or dinner. And he would be sitting there before lunch having a drink with his friends, happy, cheerful. But I thought, well, what a pity. Here's this man with his tremendous qualities, his great past. Nothing whatever to do except sit having drinks in the Carlton Club before lunch. You know, it's all very sad.
Of those elder statesmen, to whose ranks quite a number of persons are anxious to promote me.
Churchill himself began to believe that his political career was finished.
Ultimately, if I'm good.
He'd come up to Oxford to speak in support of my professor, his friend, Professor Lindemann, who was at that time trying to get into Parliament. And the prof brought him into the lab on the Saturday morning and wanted to show him what I was doing in the way of trying to detect aeroplanes. And, well, he seemed at that stage so tired, looked rather florid and so forth. When he went out, we said, poor old Winston, he can't last much longer.
I said to my companions, I said, is that Churchill, Winston Churchill? And they said, yes, it is. That's him. I said, oh, I wonder if I dare go over and introduce myself. I have some letters that I've been asked to deliver by hand to him, and I don't really know him like I do the younger generation, but I wonder if I dare. And they said, oh, yes, of course. He's a nice, easygoing old boy. You know, he's had every job in the cabinet. He's done everything, a wonderful old history, but he's now washed up. There's no future, so he's now a party of one in the House of Commons, and so he's interesting with memories, but you'll find him a nice old bird to talk to. And that was just 2 years before the war broke out, and his greatest future was ahead of him.
In March 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. At Munich 7 months later, the British and French gave in to his demands for part of Czechoslovakia.
Here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
Neville Chamberlain, Britain's Prime Minister, promised peace for our time.
Chamberlain always thought that Winston was prejudicing the possibility of a peace. He found him a real obstacle to his policy, and that view was shared not only by Chamberlain and Baldwin, but by most of the cabinet at that time.
Once again, the rattle of a German army on the march echoes in Europe.
In March 1939, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement and occupied the Czech capital, Prague. Churchill, denounced by many of the appeasers as a warmonger, was proved right.
We must ask, is this a call to war? Does anyone pretend that preparations for resistance against aggression amounts to the unleashing of war? I declare it to be the sole guarantee of peace.
One always had this sense that he was waiting in the wings. He invited me to lunch at the Savoy and simply asked me whether I thought the youth of England were ready for war against Hitler, and even knew it was coming.
One man who shared and promoted Churchill's views was Stephen Laurent, editor of Picture Post. He interviewed Churchill on a memorable visit to Chartwell.
And so we had lunch, and I remember it was steak and kidney pie. And I didn't like steak and kidney pie, but I took a little bit. But Mr. Churchill had a steak and kidney pie in a bowl. And instead of taking the spoon, and as I did, he took the bowl to his mouth, and he took the spoon and shoveled the steak and kidney pie in. And I was just looking, at him, what he was doing. Then he had the cigar there at the table, at the ashtray. So he took the cigar, he puffed a couple of things, put it back, shoveled again. Then he had a little glass, not a little, quite a big glass of brandy. So he drank a little brandy, and then I looked at him, I didn't believe it, there was a piece of chocolate, and while he shoveled, the steak and kidney pie, he stopped for a second and put a chocolate in his mouth. And I said, I don't believe it. There's no such a thing.
Picture Post was to carry several articles on Churchill. One of them stated, his greatest moment is still to come. A nationwide campaign began to bring Churchill back. People realized he was the one man prepared to resist the growing menace of Hitler.
Military. We put up with
Chamberlain now asked Churchill to join the War Cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty. That morning Churchill told the Commons, "We are fighting to save the whole world from the pestilence of Nazi tyranny." That same evening the Admiralty signalled to the fleet, "Winston is back."
The First Lord sees the machines and the men and the way they live. And so far as the men are concerned, there's welcome written all over their faces.
True to character, Mr. Churchill rings the changes on his headgear and, inspecting an RAF unit, appears in a cap of the Royal Yacht Squadron.
Mr. Churchill likes to know. Mr. Churchill's inspection is no cursory affair. And as he passes down the ranks of ratings and civilian workers, they are glad to be there.
He was underemployed because he had such an active mind and worked so hard and long that he really hadn't got enough to do with simply the Admiralty business. And he kept on interfering in the affairs of the other service ministers or the Minister of Supply or anybody. Rather annoyed some of them, I think.
Churchill's frustrations grew. It was the period of the phony war, when the only action was taking place at sea. But naval news was often bad, with the frequent loss of British ships and men. In April 1940, German troops occupied Denmark and southern Norway. Seeing the chance of forestalling the Germans, Churchill had long wanted the fleet sent to Norway. But the cabinet had delayed too long, and the Germans got there first. For 3 weeks, the British struggled in vain to drive them out. The battle for Norway was a disaster, for which some blamed Churchill. Many Conservative MPs, however, had decided that it was Chamberlain who had to go, and that Churchill, now seen as the watchdog of Britain's security, should replace him. In the Commons, 80 Conservative MPs voted against the government. A coalition with Labour was inevitable. But the Labour leaders, Attlee and Greenwood, said Labour would not serve in any government led by Chamberlain.
Goodbye, Mr. Chamberlain, and thanks for all you've tried to do.
On the 10th of May 1940, Chamberlain resigned. The question was, who would succeed him? Would it be Winston Churchill, whose voice from the wilderness had for years predicted the menace of Hitler? Or Lord Halifax, a leading advocate of appeasement who was supported by the majority of Conservatives?
Why get rid of Chamberlain to put in Halifax? It's like getting rid of the organ grinder to put in the monkey. So Labour made it clear. It was Labour who, as the Tory backbenchers said, must speak for England, and they spoke for England by saying that Churchill was a man they would support now.
He was a good fighting man, and this is a time when you wanted your leaders fighting people, not politicians, whatever their views, and they were solidly behind him.
There was only one person who could hold the country together in what was coming to us and what did come to us within a matter of days.
On the evening of the 10th of May, Churchill became Prime Minister. It was, he later wrote, as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour. But he warned that hard times lay ahead.
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy.
On both the world stage and in his own home, Churchill was renowned for his ability to turn a phrase. Once, for example, a friend of his mother's announced, "I've never cared for your politics, Winston, but my distaste is nothing compared to my feelings for that dreadful mustache." To which Winston shot back, "I see no earthly reason, ma'am, why you should come in contact with either one." In our next episode, we'll follow Churchill into battle as he leads the British nation through some of the bloodiest conflicts of World War II. Until then, I'm Peter Graves for A&E. See you next time on Biography. In the darkest hours of World War II, when Britain stood alone against the overwhelming might of Nazi Germany, the burden fell on one man above all others to rally the beleaguered country. His name was Winston Churchill, and this was his finest hour. I'm Peter Graves, and this is Biography. If ever a man was matched to a moment, then such a man was Winston Churchill in 1940 and 41. All around, Europe had been overrun by the Nazi blitzkrieg, and only England still resisted, bombarded night after night in fierce aerial attacks. In this grim time, Winston Churchill came into his own as a leader, his emotional speeches igniting his country. He would later say, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour." What follows is a portrait of Churchill during the pivotal months when Britain fought for survival. An intimate profile is told through the friends and co-workers and personal staff that stood with him. Join us now for Churchill, To Conquer or to Die.
On the 10th of May 1940, as German forces drove into France, Belgium and Holland, Churchill became Prime Minister. He was 65.
I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister in a solemn hour for the life of our country, of our allies, and above all, of the cause of freedom. A tremendous battle is raging in France and Flanders. The Germans, by a remarkable combination of air bombing and heavily armored tanks.
Within 2 weeks of Churchill becoming Prime Minister, the German army had smashed through the Allied defenses in France. hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were in full retreat before the German blitzkrieg. For Churchill, there could be no question of surrender.
Arm yourselves and be ye men of valor, and be in readiness for the conflict. For it is better for us to perish in battle than to look upon the outrage of our nation and our altars.
It was as if the man had been waiting for this moment all his life, and it was as if we had been waiting all our lives for this man to come forward.
When you're up against the threat of defeat, as we certainly were, and when we were standing alone, then you have to have somebody like Churchill who isn't rational, who isn't weighing up the chances soberly, but who is giving rein to his romantic fantasy life in his speeches, and who rallies everybody round so that people become heroes and work twice as hard.
Now at last the gloves are off. There will be no more hesitation on our part. We must return 10 blows for every one we get. Now the Allied war machine is rolling on with a momentum that cannot be...
When Mr. Churchill took over in May 1940, the whole place exploded. It was as if a current of high voltage electricity was let loose, not only in Number 10 itself, but throughout the fusty corridors of Whitehall. And we heard that civil servants were seen, elderly civil servants were seen running along the corridors.
The even tenor of our life was entirely upset by this tornado which appeared on the horizon. But it suddenly became frightfully exciting because one realized that the country was at war.
He introduced stickers saying, "Action this day," or when requesting information from heads of departments or ministries, he would put "report to me" on one side of a page. And those who worked personally for him, night duty meant just that. I never remember being released to get to bed before 1 a.m., and it was more often 2 to 3 a.m.
In 6 months of Churchill, there was 5 years of change. It was, again, quite a remarkable thing. He cut through all the red tape. He put Beaverbrook into aircraft production, for example, and within a very short time, Beaverbrook had doubled the number of aircraft that were being produced, simply by cutting through the red tape. And Churchill was a real red tape cutter.
Churchill now had to guide Britain through its greatest military disaster. At the end of May 1940, the British and French armies were trapped at Dunkirk.
We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs.
More than 300,000 British and French troops were evacuated from Dunkirk. It was a miraculous escape, but Churchill knew that wars were not won by evacuations.
Sometimes he'd put his head in his hands and hardly eat, and then he'd suddenly say, "This is one of the hardest times." I mean, he reflected everything that was going on, and there were some very bad times, some worse times than most of the normal people knew about.
We are told that Herr Hitler had a plan for invading the British Isles. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
I mean, the whole situation was so desperate and so emotional. And I think there could have been a general wave of panic and despair, but he was absolutely like a rock. I mean, there's no question of defeat, and his great speeches in the House, you know, we will fight on the beaches, we will never surrender.
We shall defend our island.
They rose in spirits. You could almost measure it. We would have gone down to the beaches then and beaten the Nazis up with broom handles. Such was the magic effect of Churchill.
In France, the situation was critical. With the French army on the verge of collapse, a desperate appeal was made to Churchill by the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud.
At 7:30 in the morning, I telephoned Churchill. I woke him up. I told him, we have lost the battle. We are beaten. But Churchill seemed so astonished that I had to repeat, we are beaten, we have lost the battle. Impossible, he said.
Churchill flew immediately to France. He knew that if France surrendered, Britain would stand alone. His destination was a crisis meeting of the French War Cabinet. He now made a dramatic personal attempt to keep France in the war. When Churchill came here, the German army was already poised to enter Paris. The French government had retreated to this small chateau in the center of France. Churchill needed to know that France would fight on, and above all would fight for Paris. But General Weygand, the commander-in-chief of the French forces, had already ordered Paris to be abandoned. Seeking to stiffen French resolve, and knowing that several of the ministers around this table wanted France to fight on, Churchill asked, "Where are the French reserves?" To which Weygand answered, "There are no reserves." To fight on, Reynaud needed more British planes, but Churchill knew that they would be needed to defend Britain if France were to fall. Churchill had told the French that even if France capitulated, Britain would fight on until victory was secured. As he left, he knew that those in charge of the destiny of France had lost the will to fight.
France was something very important for him. So to speak, he could be considered as a lover of France. And France betrayed him as a girl who leaves him and drops him abruptly, without explanation. And at the moment, it was absolutely unexpected.
I have this picture of him sort of his head buried in his hands of poor France. Yeah. On the 14th of June 1940, German forces entered Paris. A week later, France sought an armistice with Germany.
The Battle of France is over. The whole... Therefore, and its commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Churchill expected a German assault to come at any time. He had spent 10 years in vain urging greater rearmament. Now he awaited the invasion of a weak and ill-defended Britain.
We had no guns, no rifles. We had one Lee Enfield rifle, which we were allowed to go onto the range and fired only 2 bullets because there wasn't enough. And that was in the possession of the sergeant of the squad. And so during the day we trained with broom handles. I mean, if Hitler had known, he should have come straight away, you know.
I remember once when there was a talk of an invasion and all the barriers were going up around the coast and thing, and talk of children being sent overseas. And remember him one night at the dinner table saying to all of us, "You can each take a dead German with you." And I said, "But Papa, I don't know how to shoot a gun. I haven't got a gun." Looked at me very severely and said, "You can go into the kitchen and get a carving knife."
To those in Britain who now talked of surrender, Churchill said, "Let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood." He forbade all peace dealings with the Nazis. He also ordered the French warships in North Africa to surrender to the British or to sail to neutral ports. He could not risk the Germans using the French Navy against Britain. His ultimatum was refused. On the 3rd of July 1940, the Royal Navy opened fire on the warships of its ally. Over 1,200 French sailors were killed by British guns.
Nous avons été très fâchés, très mécontents, et des Anglais, de Churchill en particulier. Si Churchill avait pu venir à ce moment-là à Mademoiselle-Kébir, je ne sais pas ce que nous aurions pu lui faire. Ça, c'était vraiment une haine terrible, que nous avons conservée très longtemps d'ailleurs.
This ruthless decision to sink the French warships was the hardest Churchill had to take during the whole war.
Churchill realized that many countries, notably the United States, believed that Britain could scarcely carry on alone after the collapse of France. And he was determined to show them that the opposite was the case. 6 months later, he told President Roosevelt's emissary that Oran was the turning point in our fortunes. It showed the world that we were sincere and determined in our intention to carry on the war.
The first stage of Hitler's plan to invade Britain was to win air supremacy, so that his army could cross the Channel unchallenged. During August, hundreds of German aircraft launched their deadly raids, daily against Britain's ports and airfields. The Battle of Britain had begun. Britain's fate now lay in the hands of a few hundred pilots. Many had learnt to fly for fun before the war. Now they were taking on the full might of the German Air Force.
It's the time, he said, there is a time to live and there is a time to die. He was referring to the pilots because Winston related to young people, and I think in war particularly he was terribly conscious that he was the person that was instigating them going to their death, possibly. And I think this bothered him enormously.
By September, over half of Britain's pilots had been shot down, and many killed. On one occasion, from the operations room, Churchill could see that every squadron was in the air. There were no reserves. but he refused to be downhearted.
Never despair, but certainly gloom when the news was very bad, the loss of lives, awful. And my father, of course, understood what each loss meant in relation to our actual strength.
All our hearts go out to the fighter pilots, whose brilliant actions we see with our own eyes day after day. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Against the odds, Hitler lost the battle against Britain's airfields. Now he sent his bombers over Britain's cities. When raids took place over London, Churchill stayed in the capital, often watching from the roof of one of the government buildings in Whitehall.
I remember on one occasion, it was very lively around St. James's Park and the environs, heavy bombing. And he said, "Are you frightened, Miss Holmes? Are you sure you're not frightened?" I said, "No, I'm not frightened." It was impossible to be frightened in his presence.
As more and more German bombs fell on London, Churchill and his closest advisors were forced to move underground. Here they worked in cramped conditions, often hearing the thud, thud, thud of bombs falling on London above. Churchill had a study here. This was his bed. To this room, British intelligence brought him news of Germany's most secret invasion plans. Behind this curtain was a map on which were marked the most vulnerable points of Britain's sea defences. Churchill alone knew the extent of the danger. Yet the British public looked to him for words of reassurance that Britain would not go under.
The British nation is stirred and moved, and it never has been at any time in its long, eventful, famous history. And it is no hackneyed trope of speech to say that they mean to conquer or to die. What a triumph the life of these battered cities is over the worst that fire and bomb can do.
He scarcely stopped in his journey through cheering men and women. It's another way of saying, are we down...
By the end of December 1940, the city of London, the East End and the London docks had been severely damaged. In 5 months, more than 22,000 civilians had been killed.
In the outer suburbs somewhere, in a rather poor region of London there, little shops and things, there was a long queue of people outside a shop. So he instantly told the man to stop, the driver to stop, and told his detective to go and see what the queue was about. This was important because queues of anything in conditions like that are a danger signal. Serious shortages may herald discontent, and he just always wanted to be sure on that. So the detective went off to find out what it was, and he came back, and Churchill said, "Well, what are they queuing for?" "Birdseed, sir." And Winston, he did weep. I mean, the great tears. The thought of these wretched people queuing in the dusk of the raids just beginning for their canaries. I think it was part of his character, his quality, that he wasn't ashamed to be emotional.
The people of Britain, they wouldn't have shown that heroism and stamina if they'd thought they got a weak leadership that was waiting to sell them down the river. And of course, Churchill epitomized that fighting spirit. You know, you had the feeling, if you were in those London blitzers, that as you walked among the bomb-racked streets, you could just turn the corner and run into Winston Churchill. Because he was in touch. He would go out from his little hidey hole and see for himself. He would share risks, he would share danger. And he completely created the will of the British people to fight, whatever the cost, to the very end. Surrender seemed inconceivable. And you need that, you know, when you're all in the front line, as we all were then.
We ask no favors of the enemy. We seek from them no compunction. On the contrary, if tonight the people of London were asked to cast their votes, do your worst, and we will do our best.
Throughout these critical times, Churchill was supported by his wife Clementine. She shared his worries and visited the bomb-damaged cities with him.
The marriage of Clementine and Winston Churchill was remarkable, and the tender love between them for a young girl to observe was most interesting and a great example of the wisdom that if you love somebody, lose no opportunity to express it. And this they did verbally, and when apart, nurtured in tender notes. And they had this wonderful, amusing side that he would sign his letters with a pig and she would sign hers with a cat. It was this lovely, lovely relationship. This does not mean to say that they agreed on everything. Far from it.
I don't think I'd quite describe it as contented. I don't think that's quite the word, because they naturally had arguments and so on. I think one of my first impressions was that they were both selfish. But perhaps they had to be. They're absolutely matched. They could talk, and obviously they were very much in love. And they were tremendous companions. You see, she was an educated woman with a very good brain. And she wasn't just beautiful. He liked beautiful women, but they had to have brain as well. And she could match him in conversation and in every way.
I think it was very important to have Clemmy there, who didn't believe in flattery. And, you know, she would, there was a wonderful letter, I know, that she wrote to him at one point during the war, saying that he was being very rude and objectionable to all his staff, and they were all very unhappy, and that he should know about it and shape up.
Churchill's rough, sarcastic behaviour grew worse as Hitler's bombing intensified, and the burdens on him grew almost to breaking point. These were hard times, and the stress was beginning to tell.
Well, he could get into a rage. He could. Once I knew him to throw the telephone on the floor because somebody on the telephone had annoyed him, and it broke. And he said, when he'd recovered a bit, he said, "You won't tell them how it happened, will you?"
I'd been warned that he would not be pleased to see a new face coming to serve him. And this evening, it was at the in the study at the annex. I went in for dictation, and he gave me a sharp look as I went in, said nothing. And when I started typing, I found that somebody had left the typewriter at single spacing, whereas, of course, we all knew it had to be done in double spacing at all times. I didn't know what to do, so I just carried on. Presently he came behind to see how I was getting on, and he just exploded like a rocket. And he returned to his ministers at the other end of the study, and I heard him saying, "The mug, idiot, bloody fool." So then he sent me out and sent for somebody who, he said, could do his work right the first time.
It was a sin to ask him to repeat anything because it upset his train of thought, and he objected to this very much. And I did a lot of work when I was on trips abroad with him straight onto the typewriter. And I learnt from experience that if you didn't hear a word, and sometimes he wasn't all that clear, you couldn't say, "Prime Minister, I didn't hear," but you just leave, you hoped, a sufficient blank to put in a missing word when it was finished. And then he would, not very happily, tell you which words you fix, and then you could just probably squeeze it in the right space.
In public, Churchill spoke of victory. But he knew that Britain could win only if America entered the war. Roosevelt had assured America it would remain neutral. Churchill had to persuade him at least to send the maximum military help.
It must be remembered, which the British often forget, that just before the war broke out, Mr. Roosevelt was for a long time considered an isolationist. He was not a supporter. He was not pro-Nazi, but he was all for the United States keeping well out of any European problem, regardless what it was. And that is forgotten. And he was slowly won over and brought over, I think, for the most part, by Churchill.
Churchill decided to appeal directly to the American people.
Every month that passes adds to the length and to the perils of the journey that will have to be made. United we stand, divided we fall.
When Churchill made speeches that were obviously designed to draw America into the war, I just wished he'd shut up and drop into the deep blue sea. At the time, I felt it was not helpful to what was going on in the world, and I felt that there was only trouble ahead for the U.S. and the rest of the world. There were many Americans who were very distrustful of British imperialism, particularly as represented by Winston Churchill. He was an old-fashioned man who, some of us thought, was not a real Democrat with a little d at heart. British had maintained their colonies for years, and obviously Winston Churchill was loath to give them up.
The British colonies were to prove a vital bargaining point. In return for providing America with naval and air bases in the British West Indies, Churchill persuaded Roosevelt to give Britain 50 old destroyers.
Churchill knew that he needed the destroyers for our survival. The other was, I think he was quite keen to involve the Americans as far as possible. And anything which sort of brought the Americans nearer to the war, which this did, was advantageous.
Why the thumbs up? Because the American...
Under Lend-Lease, arms and supplies would now come from America on a pay-later basis. This was a generous gesture by Roosevelt. Churchill called it the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. Britain was still bracing itself for a full-scale German invasion across the Channel when in June 1941 Hitler attacked Russia. From secret intelligence sources, Churchill had been able to warn Stalin of Hitler's impending attack.
Сталин был вообще очень недоверчивым человеком. Я думаю, что кроме себя он никому полностью никогда не доверял. И поэтому предупреждения, которые шли с Британских островов, он отнесся к ним как к типичной дипломатической попытке толкнуть Советский Союз на борьбу с Германией.
Churchill was never a real friend of Russia. He understood that Russia is now needed because it is fighting the enemy that is threatening Britain, and I think it was a great relief for Churchill when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, and then he understood that now Britain will survive. And this was then, of course, a political gesture when he immediately pronounced his speech next day after the invasion.
Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. It follows, therefore, that we shall give whatever help we can to Russia and to the Russian people.
The communist state that Churchill had wished to strangle at its birth in 1917 was now a crucial ally. But as the German armies swept through Russia, Churchill feared that Hitler's ambitions to dominate the world could now become reality. Of that summer, Churchill wrote, "Normally I wake up buoyant to face the new day. Then I awoke with dread in my heart." He was now possessed with one idea: to bring America into the war. In August 1941, he crossed the Atlantic with his chiefs of staff for his first meeting with Roosevelt.
Churchill was going to come aboard, and he was coming aboard from the Prince of Wales, which had just come in and anchored a little short time before. And Father was standing at the and I was holding his arm to steady him, and he was getting ready at the head of the gangplank for the Prime Minister to come aboard. Well, the Prime Minister came aboard and advanced toward my father with his hands out, and it was the most moving experience. It was just like they were old friends who had just come back together, hadn't seen each other for quite a while.
One felt it was the beginning of a tremendously close relationship, and one could tell whenever the Prime Minister referred to President Roosevelt, as he would in messages to London and so forth, that there was this tremendous confidence, relief, and already a sincere friendship.
As a result of Churchill's urgings and the arguments of the British Chiefs of Staff, Roosevelt agreed to send more weapons to Britain and to give aid to Russia on a massive scale. But despite the friendliness, not a single American officer, one of Churchill's staff recorded, showed the slightest keenness to be in the war on our side.
All of the crews of both vessels were gathered together on the Prince of Wales. The service was held on the Fantail, and the President and the Prime Minister sat together with all of their advisors ranged around them, and the crew were perched all over the rest of the vessel.
The Prime Minister really chose the hymns, and it was really most impressive, and I could see, I was a little way away from him, but he was obviously visibly affected. He was a very kind-hearted, emotional man.
And you could see my father very, very moved. And while I couldn't see whether he was actually crying, I knew that he was very close to it. And I felt that this was probably one of the great moments of history.
After 4 days of talks here off Newfoundland, Churchill and Roosevelt signed the Atlantic Charter, pledging to restore sovereignty to all states overrun by the Nazis. Churchill was disappointed, however, that America still had no intention of entering the war. In December 1941, the Japanese struck the American fleet at Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
To Churchill's amazement, Germany now declared war on the United States. America had at last become Britain's ally against Hitler. Churchill had no doubts about how the conflict would end. "I went to bed," he later wrote, "and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful."
Winston was delighted, of course, because this meant that the Americans were in the war. And they wouldn't have come in willingly, you know, for a very long time if this hadn't happened.
Within a week of Pearl Harbor, Churchill left Britain for Washington. Britain and America were now at war with both Germany and Japan. At their talks in the White House, Churchill and Roosevelt pledged that war and peace would be made together, and Roosevelt agreed that the defeat of Germany must come before the defeat of Japan. Churchill worked day and night that Christmas on the most important speech of his life. Roosevelt had asked him to speak to Congress, still reluctant to become involved in a war in Europe.
The fact that my American forebears have for so many generations played their part in the life of the United States, and that here I am, an Englishman, welcomed in your midst, makes this experience one of the most moving and thrilling in my life, which is already long and has not been entirely uneventful. By the way, I cannot help for reflecting that if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own.
I was, of course, deeply impressed not only with the great rolling cadences and the prose, but the substance, and also with the joke which amused Congress so much about how he might have gotten there on his own if his parentage had been turned around the other way. And it was a very, very impressive talk, a talk that left, I think, a lasting impress on me. The substance of it was a message of hope, a message of the vital necessity of fighting the war, and for young soldiers who were just in the Army and who were not really all that perhaps convinced that we actually had to fight. It was not only an enormous inspiration, but it was a very welcome lift, not just to the day, but for most of the years of the war.
But the pace and pressure of Churchill's visit to America now began to take its toll.
Late one night, after a long discussion with the President and his staff, Churchill felt the need for fresh air. Struggling to open a window here in the White House, he collapsed. It was a heart attack. "You're not to tell me to rest," he told his doctor. "I won't, I can't. Nobody else can do this job. I must." At the very moment of America's entry into the war, Britain could not be seen to have an invalid prime minister with a damaged heart and an uncertain future. The news of the illness had to be kept secret.
3 days after his heart attack, the 67-year-old Prime Minister went by train to Canada.
When Mr. Churchill went to Canada, what a reception he got on arrival in Ottawa.
It was like having a god come out. One realized why the Romans deified their successful generals and emperors. One of the things I had to do in Ottawa was to take care of all the presents which were sent to him. There were thousands of presents from all over Canada came. Silk handkerchiefs embroidered with the flaxen hair of young women. Cigars by the thousand, and the instructions there, he wasn't allowed to smoke them for security reasons, but our instructions were to destroy them by fire, which we did.
He went to Parliament House to make the second of those great speeches he delivered from overseas.
We have been concerting the united pacts and resolves of more than 30 states and nations to fight on in unity together, without any thought except the total and final extirpation of the Hitler tyranny, of the Japanese frenzy, and the Mussolini flop.
Presently, he referred to those black days in 1940, just before the fall of France, and the talks he had with the French cabinet at that time.
When I warned them that Britain would fight on her own, come next.
From Canada, Churchill went back to Washington. He was exhausted. When he reached the White House, the change in him was noticed immediately.
He was not in very good shape. As a matter of fact, I was quite surprised at his wan expression, because he was quite a ruddy, round-faced individual, and he looked so terribly drawn that it was quite noticeable. And also, he didn't seem to have the bounce.
Despite his success in America, in Britain, Churchill's leadership was being questioned as disaster followed disaster. In the Atlantic, Britain was losing over half its convoys to German U-boats.
I don't think people ever really appreciated how desperately close run thing that was. That the German wolf pack, the submarines out in the Atlantic, really were in very serious danger of cutting our lifelines. It could have been absolutely desperate, and the losses in merchant shipping simply could not have gone on.
In North Africa, the British Army was in retreat. In the Far East, Britain's empire had been overrun by the Japanese. The biggest blow to Churchill had been in February 1942, when Singapore surrendered. 62,000 Indian, British and Australian troops were taken into captivity. At home, people were becoming dispirited and resentful. After 2 years of war, they expected Churchill to bring them the victory he had promised. That summer, a vote of censure was brought against him in the Commons. His very position as Prime Minister was challenged.
This was a very, very difficult period, and I think that it was a period when also we felt that Winston was being criticized. And I remember going to the House of Commons to listen, my mother-in-law to listen to some of his speeches, and being really quite worried. I don't think any of us thought that his reign as Prime Minister was as secure as when you read history it seemed to be.
It's the only time in the whole war I saw him looking really anxious. Because the only thing he feared in the world, you know, was Parliament. He was frightened of Parliament. He was a good Democrat. And he said, this is going to be a critical debate, you know.
Churchill won by a large majority, but an opinion poll showed half the country dissatisfied with the conduct of the war.
The end may be far off. We cannot tell. That depends upon the enemy. How long he will resist, we cannot tell. How long that wicked man will torture and afflict the nations, how often or in what directions he will set his murder machine in motion, we cannot tell.
The war situation worsened with every day. German forces were now within a few miles of Moscow. Russia was bearing the brunt of Hitler's aggression and suffering horrendous losses. Churchill and Clementine urged public support for Russia.
The people of Russia have set up a new standard of courage and of endurance in the terrible sufferings through which they are going. We must pray to God that we shall not be subjected to the same trials which they are undergoing. But if we are, I think that we shall have a very great example to follow.
In North Africa, the British army had been thrown back by Rommel to Alamein. Egypt and Suez were now threatened. A young British officer who was on leave in London asked to see Churchill to tell him that the Desert Army had lost confidence in its commanders.
Suddenly a telephone call comes through, Downing Street on the line, and the senior official I was talking to was rather chuffed, thought it was for him. Could Julian Emery come round to number 10 at once? So I went round, and there was Churchill at the cabinet table with Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the General Staff, sitting beside him, otherwise nobody. I think it was private secretary. And he asked me about the situation, and I explained that I thought the army was demoralized, and Sir Alan Brooke looked pretty cross that a junior officer, who was only a captain, could express that sort of opinion. And he tried to intervene, but Churchill shut him up and said, go on. And so I explained, and Churchill then said, is there anything we can do? And so I said, well, you can't get the tanks there any quicker, but if you were to go out yourself, show yourself to the army, visit the regiment, make a speech or two, it might make all the difference.
Premier paid a visit to an advanced landing ground where he met
In August 1942, after nearly 3 years of war, Churchill needed a victory in the field. He flew to North Africa to visit the British Eighth Army.
He arrived in a curious hat, rather like a tortoise on his head. And I imagine that he'd asked for this hat as a memory of his own time in India, because he was very sensitive about his skin. He sunburnt very easily, so this enormous topi. Anyway, he appeared and shuffled across the sand. We were lined up to be introduced to him. And then, after we'd shaken hands with this small man, much great surprise that he, because one held him in such respect, veneration, that he should be so tiny, although rather paunchy, it was a great surprise. He loved being the man on the spot, and he loved the smell of powder. He liked taking part in these things. He would visit the forward troops, and if there were any guns about that he could possibly get his hands on, so to speak, he would like to have fired them. I think he'd been a soldier in his day, and he now was an old war horse sniffing powder, I think.
Churchill found the British troops in bad shape. This splendid army, he wrote to Clementine, is baffled and bewildered by its defeats. There seem to be no plans for an offensive, no attacking zeal. Churchill realized that to the army commanders, Rommel seemed invincible.
I remember him in his bedroom in Cairo with his great dressing gown on with dragons all over it, and his little black velvet slippers, stamping up and down the room saying, Rommel, Rommel, what else matters but beating Rommel? In other words, his mind was entirely fixed on how to win a battle in the Western Desert and to drive the Germans away.
The British commander was General Auchinleck, the Auk. Senior officers told Churchill that Auchinleck should be replaced. He probed Auchinleck's plans to take the offensive.
He said to the Auk, well, General, what are you going to do about it? Or words to that effect. And the Auk was very inarticulate and left the impression that he wasn't quite clear what he was going to do about it. And I remember Hugh Mannering and I, not having been called on, walked away through the sand, wondering who would replace the Auk. I remember we said, who will we get now?
Auchinleck's successor as commander of the Eighth Army was to be General Montgomery. Churchill told Clementine, if he is disagreeable to those about him, he is also disagreeable to the enemy. Churchill then flew eastward to Moscow for his first ever meeting with Stalin.
Nobody expected that Churchill would come out from the belly of the plane, not at the door usually or somewhere. So we saw first his legs, and then we saw the upper part of his body, and then finally came his head.
Churchill had only bad news for the Russians. It was, he said, like carrying a large lump of ice to the North Pole. Churchill had come to Moscow to tell Stalin the brutal truth. Britain and the United States simply did not have the resources to launch a successful invasion of Western Europe in 1942. With the German army less than 100 miles from Moscow and preparing to launch a massive new offensive in the south, the Russians had their backs to the wall. Churchill feared most a Soviet capitulation. When the two leaders met for the first time in the Kremlin, here in Stalin's study, Churchill knew that what he had to say could seriously threaten the fragile alliance. Stalin demanded what he thought Russia had been promised, an Anglo-American invasion of Europe in 1942. Churchill explained that the Western Allies did not yet have the resources for such a massive undertaking.
Of course, it was a great discouragement for Stalin. So he said that he cannot accept this decision. And then he said, you British are afraid of fighting. The Germans are not supermen. You cannot win a war if you don't fight.
Stalin was his usual gruff, ungrateful, rude self, and was complaining about no second front, and never once showed any appreciation for all the equipment which England was shipping out there, or even said, I'm sorry you've lost so many ships on the North Atlantic run to Moscow or to Russia.
He was making the most outrageous remarks, such as, if you fought the Germans a bit more, you wouldn't be so frightened of them. Well, you can imagine saying that to Churchill.
And so when Winston came back, he was in a filthy mood, because he obviously didn't care for him anyway, never had done. And he said to me, take a telegram to Mr. Attlee. Mr. Attlee was the Deputy Prime Minister. And he started saying in this telegram exactly what he thought of Stalin, this rude, ungrateful man, etc., etc. And Clark Carr, the ambassador, said, Prime Minister, I must remind you that this room will be bugged like all the rooms in Moscow. I think he thought, well, Winston would quieten down his criticism a bit, but it had the exact opposite effect. Knowing Winston, then he really said exactly what he thought of Stalin and all I've mentioned before about him being ungrateful and rude, and said, if this continues, we shall return to England. I won't stay. Anyhow, next day, Winston had another meeting arranged with Stalin, and the whole atmosphere had changed. So he'd obviously had a transcript of his very outspoken message to Mr. Attlee, and obviously didn't want the British Prime Minister to leave it after being there a day or day and a half. So it changed the whole atmosphere of the conference.
Despite his disappointment, Stalin accepted Churchill's reasons as valid.
I think that Stalin, you see, he was a very pragmatic person. He couldn't force the British and the Americans to change their mind and to start the invasion. He couldn't do that. But on the other hand, he understood how important is the alliance.
The visit ended with a banquet. Toasts were drunk to the defeat of Hitler. Britain's substantial military aid to Russia would go on. The alliance had held. On his way home, Churchill returned to the desert. There he greeted Montgomery, the new commander of the Eighth Army.
I think that he sensed that the arrival of Montgomery had made a significant difference to the morale of the troops. And as he went about, he himself obviously got cheered and that sort of thing, naturally enough. I think Churchill went away then very much aware that the situation was in safe hands.
I want to insist on everyone that the bad times are over. They are finished. Our mandate from the Prime Minister is to destroy the Axis forces in North Africa. It can be done, and it will be done.
Montgomery had to wait for reinforcements and for intelligence reports to confirm that the Germans were running out of vital fuel. Churchill fretted at any delay on the part of his commanders.
Monty, like all generals, annoyed him at various times because they didn't always do what he wanted them to do at the time he wanted them to do it, and Monty wouldn't be hurried and he wouldn't be pushed about.
On October the 23rd, 1942, launching the heaviest artillery barrage of the war, Montgomery struck at Alamein. After 12 days of battle, the Allied breakthrough came. Rommel's once invincible army was in full retreat. Hitler had ordered victory or death. Now 10,000 Germans and Italians were dead on the battlefield. A further 30,000 had surrendered. Here at last was the victory for which Churchill and Britain had waited so long.
We have victory. A remarkable and definite victory. A bright gleam has caught the helmets of our soldiers and warmed and cheered all our hearts. Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
On Churchill's instructions, the church bells, which had been silent since the beginning of the war, were rung throughout Britain. Tonight, he told his staff, there is sugar on the cake.
The Battle of Alamein takes its place with the most famous victories in British history. Up till Alamein, we survived. After Alamein, we conquered.
Montgomery's victory at Alamein was one of the first indications that the tide of war might finally be turning. But, as we'll see in our next episode, Churchill had to lead Britain through many more bloody months of battle before the Allies could contemplate the great invasion, the invasion that would liberate Europe. I'm Peter Graves for A&E. Until next time on Biography. He battled the Boers in South Africa and the dervishes along the Nile, but never had his country faced a foe like Nazi Germany. For Winston Churchill, these were the years of blood and tears and sweat, the years in which he would lead England to victory. I'm Peter Graves, and this is Biography. Throughout his long career, Winston Churchill was several times accused of being a pessimist, a warmonger. But when the battle came to be, in the bloody years between 1942 and 1945, few leaders were as prepared. Churchill led his nation through one key conflict after another, the assault on Sicily, the D-Day invasion, the battle for France. And if his public inspirational role was crucial, Churchill played an important role out of the public eye as well, prodding and shaping the war plans, even proposing a last-minute alternative to the Normandy invasion. What follows is a behind-the-scenes glimpse of Churchill at work as the Allied forces were beginning to close in on Nazi Germany. Join us now with Winston Churchill on the road to victory.
In January 1943, Churchill flew to North Africa to greet the victor of Alamein, General Bernard Montgomery, and to celebrate the defeat of Rommel by the Eighth Army.
The man who had fought as a subaltern in the Middle East 40 years earlier was more than a little proud to be among the soldiers who had won victory in the desert. He told them that his directive to General Montgomery, brief and very much to the point, had been, sweep Rommel out of Africa. The Eighth Army had done so.
In Tripoli, Churchill took the salute at the first victory parade of the war. The Desert Army had proved to the world that the invincible German war machine could be defeated.
It was an awfully good parade. It was astonishing that these soldiery could emerge from the desert looking so superb. I mean, their kit, obviously a new issue for the parade, I should think. Both the New Zealanders and the 51st Highland Division, who did the two marches past Churchill and Alex and Montier, etc., etc., they did march absolutely superbly. Churchill was obviously very moved, so he stood there with the tears pouring down his cheeks while he watched this. It was very moving for everybody.
The final victory in North Africa took longer than Churchill expected. It had taken 6 months from Alamein to the surrender of all German and Italian forces in North Africa. The sense of victory was in the air, Churchill recalled. Britain was now master of the North African shores.
The African war is over. Mussolini's African empire and Corporal Hitler's strategy are alike exploding. The proud German army has once again proved the truth of the saying, the Hun is always either at your throat or your feet. One continent, at least, has been cleansed and purged forever from fascist or Nazi tyranny. It is interesting to compute what these performances have cost these two wicked men and those who have been their tools or their dupes. The African excursions of the two dictators have cost their countries, in killed and captured, 950,000 soldiers.
Churchill told the troops, after the war, when a man is asked what he did, it will be quite sufficient to say, I marched and fought with the Desert Army. In Tunis, German prisoners were paraded before him.
In this procession, there was an immaculate German general who was sitting rigidly, looking neither to the right or the left, officer by his side, and they were sitting there. In this German open staff car, no petrol, it was being towed along by a mule. And as they passed the place where Winston and the entourage was standing, the general, I suppose a form salute, sort of denies right, Churchill. And Churchill looked straight at this man, and they both, for a moment, started to burst out laughing. And then the moment had gone. But it was just one of those little human touches that both responsible men, a prime minister and an enemy general, saw the ludicrous aspect of the situation at the same moment.
The troops put as much energy into the cheering as they had done into the fighting. 3 cheers were simply not enough.
On the home front, Churchill's presence was vital to the war effort. He had come to represent the country's spirit of endurance and resolution, at a time when the road to victory still seemed a long one, and the hardship and danger from German raids made life a relentless grind. But the King and the Cabinet also played their part. While Churchill was the undisputed war leader, to run the country he depended on what he called the Grand Coalition, a war cabinet of Conservatives, Labour and Liberals. He relied particularly on his Deputy Prime Minister and former Labour opponent, Clement Attlee.
He certainly respected Attlee and his ability as an organizer. And Attlee was on the spot, totally betrusted, too, with anything. If Winston wanted to go away or had to go away, he was absolutely safe to leave Attlee there.
Churchill was the leader, made the grand speeches, the figurehead, magnificent figurehead. Attlee did most of the cabinet work. He was really managed the cabinet and smoothed over all the difficulties and troubles. He did a much more important job than has generally been recognized.
Whenever Churchill went abroad or was unavailable, Attlee, as Deputy Prime Minister, took the chair at the cabinet and was a very good stand-in because he was as businesslike as Churchill was diffuse. Churchill wasted an the number of man-hours he must have wasted one way and another was quite incredible, but that was his working method. Attlee, very crisp, precise, and got through the business very well. And there was really a very, very good understanding between those two wildly different men.
In May 1943, Churchill left Attlee in charge again to travel to America. It was vital for the Americans to commit themselves to an invasion of the German stronghold in Europe. Churchill had also to reassure the Americans of British support in the war against Japan. Churchill and Roosevelt planned the next stages of the war. America would send troops to Britain for a cross-channel assault in 1944. Most important, and most secret of all, Britain and the United States would work together to build an atomic bomb. Churchill stayed at the White House. His eccentricities surprised his host.
Winston Churchill used to love to take baths, and he would do that in front of his aides. And as a matter of fact, he used to smoke a cigar when he was in the bathtub. And on one occasion, my father was wheeled in to Mr. Churchill's bathroom and had been told that Mr. Churchill was there and that he could go right in. And he went in, and he came into the room, and he saw that Mr. Churchill was in the bathtub, and he said, "Oh, excuse me, I'll come back in a few minutes." And Mr. Churchill rose majestically out of the bathtub and stepped out of the bathtub, and without ever putting a towel around him or anything, said, "The Prime Minister has nothing to hide from the President of the United States, sir."
I do not intend to be responsible for any suggestion that the war is won or that it will soon be over. That it will be won by us, I am sure. But how and when cannot be foreseen, still less foretold.
If there was a big speech about 3 days in advance, the Prime Minister would go broody. You couldn't get him to do any work. Urgent stuff was just ignored. And he just went into a sort of daze. And then quite suddenly, one evening, about 6 o'clock, he'd make some flippant remark like, "I shall need 2 young ladies tonight," and with a twinkle in his eye, which meant that both his shorthand typists, who usually alternated, both would be on duty. And after dinner, he would sit down, say at about 9:30, and he would dictate for about an hour, just straight off like that.
The way he created a speech was a wonderful bit of creativity. It was exactly like a director of a great orchestra. I always enjoyed it. He would march up and down using a cigar as a baton, trying out different words for their rhythm, discarding some, whispering to himself. But when he finally got the rhythm, then he would go on with the speech. And that was a moment that I really enjoyed. As I say, it was like seeing a great piece of music. People, you know, supposed that he was naturally an orator, but he really wasn't. It came of the hardest work I've ever seen.
I remember one in particular, which he wrote himself. He didn't dictate it. He tried and tried and tried one evening, but it just would not come. And finally he dismissed me. And in the morning, he said, "Come back at 8:30, which I did in the morning. And I went up to his room, expecting to have some dictation. But he was sitting up in bed having his breakfast with papers strewn all over the room and looking very happy indeed, beaming. And he said, "I've laid an egg."
By singleness of purpose, by steadfastness of conduct, by thinking.
He works until the sun goes down to finish off the war.
Returning from his third visit to Roosevelt in 18 months, Churchill took the controls of the flying boat as it flew across the Atlantic.
He says that Britain's going to win. Who is that man with the big cigar, whose greatest friend is FDR? He's known around from near and far, that Superman with the big cigar.
As a result of his many travels, particularly to America, Churchill was now the subject of music hall jokes.
We've had some grand trips. But it's been wonderful. I'm very thrilled to be here. I really have nothing new to report from the States. You know, the States, that's where Churchill lives. Well, he doesn't exactly live there. He just goes back once in a while to deliver Mrs. Roosevelt's laundry. But he really travels, doesn't he? Boy, he's been around. He's been to Casablanca more than Humphrey Bogart.
Behind the humor lay the reality of war. In Hamburg, 42,000 Germans were killed by British bombers in a single night.
We have inflicted shattering damage, and we are inflicting shattering damage upon the German cities, which are the centers of munition production, which, combined with other blows, may well be the precursor of decisive events in the European struggle.
The British people were beginning to believe that Churchill's promises of victory would now be fulfilled. In London, he contrasted the optimism of the present with the pessimism of the past in a speech at the Guildhall.
3 years ago, all over the world, friend and foe alike, everyone who had the with his hand against the triumphant fight of Hitler with the great Italian at his tail. We, with resources that one shudders to enumerate them even. I cannot go farther today than to say that it is very probable there will be heavy fighting in the Mediterranean and elsewhere before the leaves of autumn fall.
In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily, the first step in the attack on the European mainland. It was a risky operation across the open sea. Churchill waited up all night for news.
It was a very, very tense and torturous night for him. He was so preoccupied with that night, with whether it would be a success or a failure, and I'm sure that he related it to Gallipoli, the Dardanelles, and was wondering if another fiasco could happen. But then we'd go on playing Bezique, and he'd talk about other things, but he would always then sit down the cards and talk about the young people and the sacrifices that they were being asked to make. But at 4 in the morning, they came in to say the winds had dropped and the landings were taking place and that it was all going smoothly.
After fierce fighting, Sicily was overrun. Now Italy was the target.
Together, the British and United States forces have conquered Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and a third of Italy.
Churchill was now 69, and the strains of war were enormous. The more the pressure on him grew, the more irrepressible and demanding he became.
Well, you really never knew from one day to the next what sort of life you were going to lead. And he was quite capable of wanting some almost unfindable document at 3 o'clock in the morning, so one really had to know where everything was. The numbers of private secretaries therefore increased. The tempo increased. We tried to arrange our lives in such a way that we had a day or two off every fortnight, but I can often remember periods of the war when one was working, or was on duty anyhow, for 18 or 19 hours a day. Sometimes Churchill, you see, would start work about 8 in the morning, and he very often didn't go to bed till 4 or even 5 the following morning, but he always had a nice little sleep in the afternoon, when the wretched private secretaries couldn't very well do the same, because they had so much to catch up with, and also the telephones were ringing and so on.
He was so accustomed to stress all his life. He just got used to it. But I don't think there was any immediate secret. His own remark about it, when I asked him how he managed to wind down so easily in the evening when some of us didn't sleep all that well, he said, well, I just go to bed and turn out the light and say bugger everybody and go to sleep.
One morning when Mr. Churchill was working in bed, I was sitting behind the typewriter as usual, waiting for dictation. There was a little grey Persian cat which belonged in the flat, and Smokey, his name, he always came in to share breakfast with Mr. Churchill, and afterwards he would sit on the bed while the secret documents came out of the secret locking black box and were thrown on the bed and covered Smokey, who would be sleeping there. This morning there was a great crisis on, and Mr. Churchill was talking very seriously to Sir Alan Brooke on the telephone. And Smokey was sitting on the bed, but this morning he wasn't sleeping. He was crouched there, watching Mr. Churchill's toes, which were twiddling under the blanket. And I saw his Smokey's tail switching, and I wondered what was going to happen. And suddenly he pounced on Mr. Churchill's toes and bit right through the blanket. And Mr. Churchill had such a fright, and he gave a great kick, and he shouted, "Get off, you fool!" And Smokey did a sort of double somersault onto the floor. And Mr. Churchill, who was very fond of Smokey, then saw him sitting there a little dismayed, so he said, "Poor little thing." And poor Sir Alan Brooke couldn't think what was happening, so he hastily hung up and telephoned through to the private secretary and said, "Please, will you go into the bedroom and see what I've done? I must have upset the Prime Minister terribly, because suddenly he shouted, 'Get off, you fool!' and then he said, 'Poor little thing.' So I don't know what's going on."
As the pressures grew, so did Churchill's need for creature comforts.
He would have generally a bottle of champagne at lunch, followed by some brandy. And then he would go off to his rest. And when he came down again, he never drank tea or anything of that sort. He used to, from then on until dinner, he would sip very weak whiskey and water, or whiskey and soda. Very weak. And then at dinner, he would always have a bottle of champagne and some more brandy. And then he would, if necessary, later in the evening, he would go on with the weak whiskey and soda. But I suppose if you added it up, it was a fair amount of drink. But I never saw him in the slightest degree the worse for wear, and he never had a hangover, because when he woke up in the morning, he was always absolutely as bright as a button. The other thing I think was of great importance was he had a very good appetite. He ate a lot. And these people who suffer from drink and cirrhosis of the liver and so on, they lose their appetites and don't start not eating enough.
On the Eastern Front, the Russian armies had thrown back Hitler's forces from the gates of Moscow. At Stalingrad, the Germans had suffered their greatest defeat since Alamein. 160,000 German soldiers were killed, and 90,000 sent as prisoners of war to Siberia. In November 1943, Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt, the Big Three, held their first meeting together in Tehran. Churchill had brought a gift for Stalin from King George VI to mark the heroic Russian resistance at Stalingrad.
And I was there as interpreter. And when we came into the big hall, the British were already gathered there. All of them were there already.
This, of course, was the sword presented by the king on behalf of the people of Britain.
The sword in a big basket was brought in, and also very solemnly opened so that everybody could look at it. And then it was taken out and the sword was taken out and was then given to Churchill first, and then Churchill presented it to Stalin. And Stalin somehow a little bit awkwardly took it so that the handle was below, so the sword fell out of it to the floor. But immediately it was, certainly Voroshilov came here, it was immediately raised. But then Stalin also made a gesture by taking out a little bit the sword, and then he had kissed the blade.
Churchill was worried Russia might make a separate peace with Germany. He also realized that Stalin had aims in Europe beyond the defeat of Hitler.
We were fighting a desperate war against Hitler. We couldn't beat Hitler without the Russians' help. It was quite possible the Russians might have made a separate peace. There were moments, there were hints of that. In the early days, as we now know, it's suddenly been revealed quite recently, Stalin was offering Hitler the Ukraine if he'd stop invading Russia. Well, that was when he was in the extreme peril of losing the whole war. Even by Tehran, it was quite possible that the Russians might make a separate peace. It was not to be excluded. And it was essential for the safety of this country to keep Russia in the war and fighting against Germany.
Churchill, once the leader of the alliance, was now becoming the junior partner. The shift in power was noticeable within the big three.
Roosevelt had realized that the American strength was now really beginning to overtop our strengths by a long way, that they were the big boys and that they were going to be the only great power other than the Russians at the end of the war. And he thought that he could handle Stalin.
Churchill now knew that Stalin would expect the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and particularly Poland, as the prize of victory. He was surprised that Roosevelt showed little interest in the future of Eastern Europe. Returning to Cairo, Churchill had already conceded that Eastern Poland would go to Russia for the sake of maintaining the alliance.
We were beginning to appreciate that the Soviets were not exclusively interested in the destruction of Hitler, but wanted to take over Eastern Europe for their own Soviet empire. And Churchill came back from the Tehran conference, and there was a meeting one evening in Mr. Chester Beatty's villa outside the Pyramid. And I was only a backroom boy, but at that meeting he was heard to say, Oliver Cromwell was a great man, but he made a great mistake. Obsessed with the power of Spain, he failed to observe the rise of France. Will they say this of me? What he meant was he was beginning to question whether his concentration on the defeat of Hitler was blinding him and others to the Soviet danger which was already looming over the horizon.
And he was already looking to the post-war situation, and he had a very real fear of what Stalin and the Russians intended for Eastern Europe, and indeed for Western Europe, if they had a chance.
Churchill now began to show signs of extreme exhaustion. In North Africa, he contracted pneumonia and nearly died.
Lord Moran, who was his doctor and was with them, said he really can't go on. And my father, who up to then had said, no, absolutely, I'm going on, and, fought any suggestion that he should ease up. He must have been feeling very ill, because he jacked it in then and said, no, I can't go any further.
Lord Moran sent for nurses and for some specialists. And I think he was put on M&B, which was quite a new thing then for pneumonia. But he was so ill that for once he really couldn't work. Of course, he had very good attention, but I think it was his own willpower. I mean, he was determined to see the war through. And I think his willpower did as much as the medical assistance that he had. And I remember on Christmas Day he had so many generals to send on Carthage, and they were all together, and not the usual sort of non-stop meetings, but they were all talking about the war and strategy and all that sort of thing. So by this time we knew he was getting better.
Back in England after an absence of over 2 months, Mr. Churchill arrives in London fit and well again. Our little island just wasn't complete without him.
His illness had in fact taken its toll. Although he seemed fit again, underneath he was still worn out.
He was rather a shadow of his usual self, so quiet and lamb-like and kind, and one longed for the old sort of roar and snap and bite. And we were all so relieved.
Of the invasion plan.
Churchill thought himself a very great strategist. He was having lots and lots of ideas. He was always proposing a different strategy from what the chiefs of staff favoured. One of the reasons for this was because he simply hated having to accept the sort of what we would now call the establishment view, and thought that he was cleverer still. And he would argue and argue until he'd driven Brooke, for example, practically out of his head.
Just before D-Day, when all the plans were laid, Churchill came up with an alternative to the landings in Normandy. This proved the ultimate provocation for General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff.
Churchill, quite suddenly, late one evening, said to whoever was with him at the time, "Why are we doing this? Why are we going to throw away the lives of hundreds of thousands of our young men once again in invading the coast of France? Why don't we approach occupied France through the territory of our oldest ally, Portugal, which was, of course, neutral?" So there was, I think, a rather stunned silence as to whether this inquiry was seriously intended, but it was, and Churchill said that he wished to hear the chiefs of staff upon this subject. And Alan Brooke couldn't believe it at first. He was absolutely furious that he was to be invited to speak to this, as he saw it, total irrelevance. And he said to his briefer, "Do you know that, the Pyrenees? I do. I spent my boyhood there," which he had. "I know every track, every road. It's completely and absolutely absurd and impossible, leaving on one side the political issues of invading a neutral country and opening up a completely new theatre of operations." Well, that's what the Prime Minister wants. So Alan Brooke said, "Very well, then he shall get it." And all through that night, the planning staff was set to working out a perfectly rational statement of the pros and the cons and the difficulties and the logistic problems which would arise from such an operation, such an expedition. And next morning, Churchill adverted to this point, and Alan Brooke said, "Right, Prime Minister." And he then gave a completely cool, objective, factual account of the pros and cons. There weren't any pros, but all the cons, well set out for some time. And when he'd finished that, which was faultless, he, as it were, closed the file, and he looked at Churchill and he said, "Now, Prime Minister, I'm going to tell you what I think about your wasting of the time of my staff on absurd and irresponsible irrelevancies of that kind at a time when we're trying to conduct the war according to principles which we have all, you not least, established and agreed for some time, and really went for him." But nevertheless, one of the great things about Churchill was that he did, in the last resort, never overrule his chiefs of staff on a matter where professionally they were, as it were, doing their own duty.
He was a man with imagination of a remarkable kind, constant flow of ideas, some of which were brilliant, some of which were not so good. On the other hand, he used to try his ideas out on everybody, and sometimes people thought that he'd gone mad and was proposing to do something totally idiotic. All he was actually doing was to fly a kite and see how people reacted.
Alan Brooke used to say what a wonderful man he is. He used to then complain about him and sigh and say, that man, how can I stand it? And then he used to look up and smile and say, but where would we be without him?
D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress. The first official news came just after 9:30, when Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force issued Communique Number 1. This said, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
Churchill wanted to be among the troops as they landed. He was prevented from going in a most unexpected way.
He had decided that he was going on D-Day, the landings in Normandy. And he said, I could not see why I shouldn't have been witnessed the preliminary bombardment and, if possible, landed on the beaches in the afternoon. And he got himself a berth in HMS Belfast, the cruiser, which is now moored off Tower Bridge. Well, one can imagine the sort of consternation this caused, because obviously it was going to be pretty risky. And it finally went up to Eisenhower as Commander-in-Chief, Supreme Allied Commander. But Ike was given very short shrift when he told Winston that he shouldn't go. He said, you may be Supreme Allied Commander, but you have no right to try and regulate the complement in one of His Majesty's ships, and I'm going. And we wondered how this would ever be solved. And when I talked to Americans, I told them this was one of the real advantages of a monarchy, because it was solved in a way that none of us foresaw. The King heard about it, and he came down to breakfast the following morning and said at the breakfast table, do you know what? Winston wants to go on D-Day. He said, damn it, I was a naval officer. I was at Jutland. And if Winston can go, I can damn well go. And effectively, he said to Winston, look, I can't stop you, but if you go, I go. And Winston actually said, much too dangerous for you, sir. And the King said, look, if it's too dangerous for me, it's too dangerous for you, and you're more important in this war than I am.
6 days later, Churchill persuaded the King to allow him to cross the Channel for a brief visit to Montgomery's headquarters.
Field Marshal Montgomery, I don't think, was terribly keen to have him because it was pretty dangerous. We were being shelled and so on. Churchill wanted to see what was going on. He wanted to be right in the front line. And sometimes, and later on in the war, he got pretty close to being in the front line. And none of the generals liked this, you know. This is the British Prime Minister. If he'd been killed or something, it would have been very embarrassing.
On the day Churchill returned from France, Hitler launched the first flying bombs, the V-1. Churchill was warned by his scientists that an even more sinister weapon, the V-2 rocket, would soon be used. He suggested a lethal form of retaliation.
He put this question before the Chiefs of Staff, but would they please, now they have a look at it, that shouldn't we try to stop this by threatening to retaliate with poison gas if they did bomb us with the V-2? And, of course, there's quite a bit. This is quite well documented now. It was not anthrax, which some of the accounts have said. It was poison gas, particularly mustard gas. And this was, not we wouldn't do it, but we would threaten to do this if they opened the V-2 bombardment. But no one really supported him, and the Chiefs of Staff particularly didn't. And of course, he backed down.
The flying bombs brought a new terror to Britain, greater even than the Blitz. Many were shot down, but some got through. In 9 months, more than 8,000 civilians were killed. In October 1944, Churchill made a second visit to Moscow.
I come here on a tide of hope, on a tide of assurance that victory will be won, that it will not be indefinitely withheld, and of hope that when it is won, we shall all of us endeavor to make the world a better place for the great masses of human beings to live in.
Churchill was now preparing for the future of Europe after the war. he had come to reach an agreement with Stalin over who would control Central and Southern Europe. While in Moscow, he wrote out his thoughts on a single sheet of paper. This became known as the naughty document.
Churchill took out of his pocket a piece of paper, a rather small piece of paper, where there was already written the several countries and the percentage of influence of the Soviet Union and Britain. In some cases, America was also somehow mentioned, but it was not clear. Mostly it was about Britain and the Soviet Union.
The naughty document divided 5 countries of Europe into Soviet and Western spheres of influence. Romania, Russia 90%, the others 10%. Greece, Great Britain 90%, Russia 10%. Yugoslavia 50-50. Hungary 50-50. Bulgaria, Russia 75%, the others 25%.
So Stalin looked at that. It was quite clear what it was about, and then pushed the paper back to Churchill. Then there was silence. No, so he said nothing at all, and Churchill was also silent for some time. And then Churchill said something like, maybe we should destroy this paper, because people will afterwards think how we so easily decided and cynically decided the fate of millions of people. And Stalin said, well, why? It's your paper. You said somebody is in London is thinking about that, so why should we destroy it? You may just take it away with you.
Having conceded the eastern part of Poland to Stalin at the Tehran conference the year before, Churchill, with his naughty document, now recognized Soviet control of Central and Southern Europe. Churchill felt that his meetings with Stalin here in the Kremlin had gone well. He wrote home, "I've had very nice talks with the old bear. I like him the more I see him." But behind the friendliness, Churchill knew just how powerless Britain had become in the face of the Soviet bear. Churchill's naughty document had revealed the extent of his anxieties. The countries of Central and Southern Europe were soon to be occupied by the Red Army and to become satellites of the Soviet Union. At the same time, Churchill tried to preserve what he could of British influence. It was absolutely vital to keep communism out of Greece if British power in the Mediterranean were not to be threatened. In Greece, as the Germans withdrew, civil war broke out between communists and Democrats. Churchill sent troops to support the democratic forces and to make sure Russia could not be a threat to British interests in the Mediterranean.
Perhaps it was a reaction of a tired man that he suddenly got obsessions, as he did over Greece in the late autumn of 1944. He was so determined to save Greece from communist occupation, which was very genuinely threatened, that he really would concentrate on nothing else. And the cabinet secretary and Alec Duggan and others came to me and said, we can't get any business through. The cabinet goes on, and he talks on about Greece, Greece, Greece.
And through the street battles in an armored vehicle comes the originator of this great meeting, Mr. Churchill himself.
Much to Clementine's dismay, Churchill had decided to fly to Greece on Christmas Eve 1944 to promote a non-communist government.
When he went into Athens for a big conference at the British Embassy, somebody shot at him, missed him, and killed a woman. This upset him very much. But I think you could say that he might have been in mortal danger.
Britain's military support for the democratic forces saved Greece. Stalin did not intervene on the side of the communists. This was Churchill's dividend from the naughty document. In August 1944, Paris had been liberated by Allied forces, including French troops under General de Gaulle. De Gaulle, who had led the Free French forces since 1940, now returned to Paris a hero. For 4 years, Churchill had had to deal with him as the representative of France. He admired de Gaulle's courage and tenacity, but their relationship was seldom an easy one.
The general was a very intransigent character and a very haughty one, and they did have most awful up-and-downers. But I think they both knew what the other one was for.
There was one story about his relationship with General de Gaulle, which was uncomfortable. And he was due to meet de Gaulle, and the officials around him were trying to say, you know, sort of be patient and be careful. And he was striding up and down, not liking it at all, really. And in the end, he turned around and said, all right, I'll kiss him on both cheeks. And on all four, if you prefer it.
But all their problems were forgotten when Churchill and de Gaulle walked together down the Champs-Élysées.
The crowds in the Champs-Élysées, I'll never forget, it was a marvellous, crisp, cold day. Paris looked so beautiful that time of the year. And there was this tremendous parade. My father went with the general to lay a wreath at the eternal flame under the Arc de Triomphe, where the unknown French warrior lies buried. And then together they walked down the Champs-Élysées, and the crowds went mad. And I must say it was a most moving moment.
As the Allies swept through France, Holland and Belgium, the strains between the British and American generals began to show. The Americans now provided 2/3 of the Allied forces. Churchill had to remind Montgomery to control his resentment of Eisenhower, his supreme commander. Montgomery's lack of tact threatened the alliance and often irritated the Prime Minister.
We're at dinner in the mess, and we were about halfway through the soup course, and Field Marshal Montgomery said to him, Mr. Prime Minister, would you consider you were in the evening of life? And Churchill was furious, and he was bent over, sucking away at the soup, and he dropped the soup spoon. The soup went all over the table, and he kept his head down there for a second or two, and he growled out, perhaps late afternoon, but certainly not evening.
Whether in the afternoon or the evening of his life, Churchill at 70 was still the warrior at heart, exhilarated by his visits to the front line.
At dinner that night, one of the officers on the personal staff asked him some questions about his speeches. And I remember him saying, I love martial music. I can never get enough of it. If you lock me in a room and you play enough martial music and give me lots to drink, I will write a speech that will bring tears to any man's eyes. And in my view, that's true. He could do that.
Now, we all stand on the threshold of Germany, and it will take the full exertions of the three great powers, every scrap of strength and sacrifice that they can give to crush down the desperate resistance which we must expect. And I am sure our soldiers at the front who will not be found are incapable effort which is
In February 1945, Churchill arrived in the Crimea to meet Roosevelt and Stalin. He felt a peace settlement had to be agreed before the war ended. He was anxious about the fate of Poland.
After a 4-hour drive over bumpy roads to Yalta, through a countryside which his daughter Sarah described as bleak as the soul in despair, Churchill reached the Vorontsov Villa. This baronial hall on the Black Sea, built by a Russian aristocrat partly in Scottish style, was to be Churchill's residence throughout his talks at Yalta with Stalin and Roosevelt. Churchill later reflected, "We had the world at our feet, 25 million men marching at our orders by land and sea. We seemed to be friends. The 3 most powerful men in the world were meeting for the last time to decide the fate of millions."
Roosevelt was a sick man. He had only weeks to live.
I was quite shocked when I saw President Roosevelt at Yalta. He looked to me as though he was a dying man then. He'd lost weight, he'd lost any colour that he might have had. He looked as sick as I have seen anyone look.
The big three met at the Livadia Palace, once the summer residence of the Russian Tsar. Stalin's aim was to get the British and Americans to recognize Russian control of Central Europe. Roosevelt wanted Russian support to defeat Japan. Churchill wanted the best agreement he could get on Poland.
Churchill had moved away, as Roosevelt had, from their initial suspicion and hostility into a sort of feeling of we're all comrades together. And they had this rather, to me, rather fantastic idea that if you treat, by that time he was being called Uncle Joe, which is almost an affectionate term. If you treated Uncle Joe like a member of the club, one day he'd behave like one, which I always felt was a rather false assumption because he had a club of his own and didn't want to be a country member of ours. But still, that had been the approach and was still Roosevelt's approach at the time of Yalta.
So the conference began in a friendly way. Stalin agreed to support Roosevelt in the war against Japan. He even agreed to Churchill's request that France should be treated as one of the victorious powers. But Poland had dominated their discussions. Churchill fought hard for free and democratic elections there. He was later criticized for not fighting hard enough to wrest Poland entirely from Stalin's grasp.
More of a fight. Churchill fought like a... We'd had more discussions at Yalta on Poland than on any other single subject. Of course he fought.
What right have the Churchill to give my home, my parents' home, my wife's parents' home to Russia? What right he had? Churchill definitely was to blame. Because if he wasn't to blame, he wouldn't sign any agreement with Stalin. He would resist. He didn't.
Well, I asked the Pole what he would have wanted us to do, effectively. Would he have wanted us to go to war with Russia? And if so, how? I mean, were we to drop the atom bomb? I mean, some Poles think that Roosevelt should have threatened to drop an atom bomb on the Russians. He only had 2, by the way, or 3, I think, at that time, which were being reserved for Japan. But then, how could that have been done with the public opinion in America and Britain, which was full of gratitude and admiration for the Russian war effort?
As Churchill returned each night to his villa after the day's discussions, it was clear that the conference was not going as well as he had hoped.
When we were at Yalta, things seemed different from all of the previous meetings. There wasn't the same feeling of enthusiasm for work. There was a feeling of anxiety. Mr. Churchill was absent from our office for much of the time with meetings, and when he came back, he didn't seem anxious to do much dictation and record what had gone on, and one felt that things hadn't been the way he had wanted them to be.
My impression of Mr. Churchill's mood at Yalta was that he was melancholic, rather depressed. Perhaps he felt his teeth were drawn and he was not going to have much influence over affairs in the future. It was the 2 giants, the protagonists, the Soviet Union and the United States.
Roosevelt made it clear to Churchill that he was not interested in the fate of Poland or Central and Eastern Europe. Churchill was isolated and weakened by lack of American support. Tonight, he told his daughter as the conference ended, the sun goes down on more suffering than ever in the world.
He was, by then, the junior partner in that the United States had come in with massive force. And although he and Britain had been in the field longest, the tragedy of Yalta was the failing health of Roosevelt and the fact that he only had 6 weeks more to live. And he allowed himself to be flattered by Stalin, who said, look, we can resolve the problems of the world between us. We don't need this imperialist and warmonger Churchill. We can discuss the world like two reasonable businessmen. And this appealed to Roosevelt's vanity. And there were many conversations to which Churchill was not privy. And above all, what pulled the rug from under our feet as an alliance was the fact that Roosevelt announced to Stalin that as soon as the war was won, the United States would not hang about in Europe, that there would be a massive demobilization of American troops and they would be withdrawn from Europe. And that was music to Stalin's ears because he had no intent to demobilize his forces at all.
Even General Marshall, Roosevelt's chief of staff, had his doubts about the Yalta Agreement.
It was not long before Marshall realized Mr. Churchill was correct, and he thought that Mr. Roosevelt was very slow in appreciating the Russian threat, and I think that explains to some degree the results of the Yalta Conference. He felt that if they had bargained harder, they need not have given him anything like the control that they did.
In order to secure Stalin's promise to continue the war against Germany to the bitter end, and then to join the Western Allies in the defeat of Japan, Churchill was forced to give in to Stalin's ambitions for Central Europe. In September 1939, Britain had gone to war for Poland. In February 1945, here at Yalta, Churchill had to agree to the surrender of Poland to Soviet communist control. The Soviet Union was now a great power, claiming the spoils of victory.
Churchill's worst fears were soon confirmed. Stalin's agreement on paper to allow free elections in Poland proved worthless. As Nazi Germany crumbled before the onslaught of the Red Army, the Soviet communist grip on Central and Eastern Europe tightened. On his return to London, Churchill had to defend the agreements.
In the Yalta debate, Winston made a claim which I couldn't stomach. He said that the agreement at Yalta was an act of justice. And so I felt bound to get up and say that I couldn't accept it as an act of justice. It might be an act of expediency, but certainly not justice. And he didn't much care for this.
Now, Yalta had been in many ways a great success. I mean, we agreed on exactly how to occupy Germany, no problems. We agreed on, although we couldn't say it at the time, bringing Russia into the war against Japan, agreement on the United Nations, agreement for Churchill, which was important, on France being brought into the things. So, and on paper, good agreement on Poland and liberated Europe. I mean, on paper, if you look at them now, they're perfect diplomatic documents. Therefore, in reporting on Yalta, Churchill naturally had a tendency to describe it as a good thing. And in a way, he was justified in doing so. But as happened so often, he slightly overdid it when it came to Eastern Europe, because people naturally asked him questions, are you satisfied with the arrangements on Poland? And I think he said some phrase, yes, because when Marshal Stalin, or Generalissimo Stalin, signs an agreement, he keeps it. And that was an unfortunate phrase, which dogged him rather like Chamberlain's piece of paper when he came back from Munich in 1938.
I do think that Churchill realized it, and at times Alan Brooke, I think, recorded Churchill as it were, gazing into the middle distance with a very despondent expression and saying, we shall end this whole business with the barbarians in the heart of Europe.
The sad irony for Great Britain was that although they had won the war, they would lose the peace. The sun was starting to set on the British Empire and on Winston Churchill. But as we'll see in our next episode, even as his opponents were counting him out, the feisty Churchill had a few final surprises in store. I'm Peter Graves for A&E. Until next time on Biography. He led a life of spectacular triumphs and spectacular failures. But for Winston Churchill, the moment of his greatest victory was the eve of his greatest defeat. I'm Peter Graves, and this is Biography. Early on in his career, Winston Churchill stated, "Those who can win the victory cannot make the peace, and those who would make the peace would never have won the war." And yet it was surely one of his bitterest setbacks that within only a few weeks of VE Day, victory in Europe, the British people voted him out of office. This is the story of how Winston Churchill faced that setback. It's the story of one of the most amazing political comebacks of our time. Join us now as we present Churchill, Never Despair.
After 5 years of war, Churchill was with the Allied armies as they crossed the Rhine on into Nazi Germany. Forward on wings of flame to final victory was his message to the troops.
I got word that Churchill was coming. And the reason he was coming was that we had captured part of the Siegfried Line, the so-called dragon teeth, the concrete emplacement. They looked like small pyramids. And there was on the frontier of Germany, and there was something not only strategic about it, but symbolic, because once you penetrated that, you were penetrating Germany. And sure enough, there he comes with his cap and a cigar and trooping around with his, and expecting all these tank traps. And it came time to have a pee. And I was standing right next to him. And I could see the glint in his eye and this puckish grin when he said, "Let's do it on the Siegfried Line." And that was absolutely marvelous. I mean, here was, all of us lined up, all these generals and me and Churchill and everybody, all peeing on the Siegfried Line, on Hitler's Siegfried Line.
2 months later, in May 1945, Britain was celebrating the first day of peace in Europe.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day.
Strangely enough, in this great hour of victory, when they had been through so much together, my mother wasn't there to share in all the glorious joy and festivities of VE Day, because she was in the heart of Russia for her Aid to Russia Fund. And so my father, in this great hour of victory, was actually rather alone.
God bless you all. This is your victory. Victory of the cause of freedom.
The victory Churchill had promised in the darkest days of 1940 was now a reality. For us in Britain, he later wrote, weary and worn, impoverished but undaunted and now triumphant, we had a moment that was sublime. Churchill had hoped that the wartime coalition government would continue, at least until the defeat of Japan, but Labour demanded a general election.
I don't think he wanted an election at all. He would have liked to continue on his pinnacle of a coalition government, the great national leader. And, with nobody standing up to him and running things all his own way. And here he had to come down into the hurly-burly of party politics.
And our theme is the revival of the greatness of Britain and of the British Empire. We mustn't use the word empire. It's naughty.
My father found it very difficult to come to terms with his role as a party leader as opposed to being the leader of a great wartime coalition. And in fact, he found the change quite disagreeable. I think he'd probably rather lost his touch.
I ask you straight out to give me the chance I need to try to finish this business and bring the ship safe into port when I have steered her through a very rough and stormy voyage.
To many voters, Churchill was the great war leader, but not the man to lead Britain in peacetime. His personal popularity was still enormous.
Churchill was doing a tour of London, and he went to this meeting. And when he got there, he found the big meeting area was surrounded by posters, Labour posters, saying they're Labour posters. And it said 4 words. It said, cheer Churchill, vote Labour. Now, that was the mood of the people, of the Labour people throughout the land. And they did. They appreciated Churchill, were grateful to Churchill, but it was not the past they were thinking of, it was the future.
They said, we want a Labour government and we want Winston to be Prime Minister. That's what they said to me when I was canvassing. I said, well, you can't have that, you've got to choose. And they said, isn't it a free country? We can vote for what we like.
Churchill campaigned on the theme that socialism was a form of communism. It would impose controls and deny the people the fruits of their victory. He even identified Labour with the Nazis.
Socialism is in its essence an attack not only upon British enterprise, but upon the right of an ordinary man or woman to breathe freely without having a harsh, clumsy, tyrannical hand clapped across their mouths and nostrils. No socialist system can be established without a political police. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo.
I mean, here he was accusing, if you get a Labour government back, you will get a Gestapo. Well, I mean, Clem Attlee, been in his war cabinet, running a Gestapo.
The attempt to associate the Labour Party with the Nazis, and the Gestapo was a Nazi organization, a bit of Hitlerism, was regarded as being utterly ridiculous.
My mother read the speech before he made it and said to him, you shouldn't use that phrase. It would cause enormous offence and do a lot of harm. And my father was obstinate and said no, he thought it was quite all right.
We're going to win. I can feel it in my bones. We're going to win.
There were more than 1 million servicemen abroad whose votes could prove decisive.
They all thought that if they voted for Attlee and his government, that they were going to get demobilized much more quickly, and also, as there was a shortage of cigarettes, that the supply of cigarettes would be very much greater. And I told him this. He was very surprised, and he said, how could they do a thing like this to me after all I've done?
The election results would be delayed for 3 weeks while the service vote was counted. Having cast his vote, Churchill flew to Potsdam for the final meeting of the Big Three. Truman was now the American president after Roosevelt's death. Churchill wanted the best settlement possible with Stalin on liberated Europe, but saw little room for any real negotiation.
Churchill wouldn't read the briefs. We used to sit up all night writing briefs for them, which they didn't even look at. They thought they knew it all. Then we'd get into the meeting place. Stalin was always very well briefed, and he would put a sharp question, and Churchill would turn around and say, what's the answer to that? And of course he was rather deaf by then, and we had to hiss at him the answers, which he couldn't hear, and the whole thing became a shambles as a result.
Churchill knew that now the Red Army occupied Eastern Europe, Stalin held all the cards.
At Potsdam, it was quite clear that we were not the important player in that game. Ali Cadogan, who was then the head of the Foreign Office, was there, said this isn't a 3-power meeting, it's a 2.5-power meeting. And even half was a bit overestimating our weight at that time. Most of the negotiation was done directly between the Russians and the Americans.
The Potsdam Conference set the seal on the new map of Eastern Europe, which was to remain under communist rule for nearly 50 years. The world was now dominated by the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. Churchill left Potsdam to return to London for the results of the election, confident that he would remain Prime Minister.
Well, let's face it, whoever imagined such a result? And slowly the moral of it all struck home. Labour landslide. Labour will now have a majority over all parties in a House of 640.
They made the decision in the end to vote for the Labour Party, which meant, in effect, voting Churchill out. But there was no doubt at all, there was a sense of guilt about that. I met people the day after the election who were almost hangdog about it, saying, well, you know, what a way to treat a man who's carried us to victory. Nobody had quite realised that by voting for the Labour Party, you were in fact going to chuck Churchill out.
He couldn't realise that they had been quietly making up their minds that he was a great wartime leader, but he wasn't the man to win the peace.
He sat down at his usual chair at the cabinet table, and I sat at the chair directly opposite. And he started reminiscing to me about all these perilous and dangerous trips we'd taken together during the war and all the places we'd visited and the outcome of the war. And then he was getting very sad, you could tell by his sad expression. And then he said, and now the British people don't want me anymore. And then tears were rolling down his cheeks, and I'm not ashamed to say they were rolling down mine as well.
After what he described as the longest week of his life, Churchill went on holiday. Exhausted by 6 years of war, crushed by the election defeat, Churchill flew to Italy, to this villa on the shores of Lake Como. It was a time of recovery and peace. I am much better in myself, he wrote to his wife, and am not worrying about anything. Here it is all sunshine and calm, he wrote to one of his daughters. I paint all day and every day, and have banished care and disillusionment to the shades. This is the first time for many years that I've been completely out of this world. He spent many days at his favorite pastime, painting. Churchill wrote, "Painting is a companion with whom one may hope to walk a great part of life's journey. Happy are the painters, for they shall not be lonely."
It's interesting that his character comes through in his paintings, this love of bright colours. And he writes in his little book about his painting, "When I get to heaven, I'm expecting even more gorgeous colours, and I shall demand a palette with still brighter colours that I can employ, and I shall spend my first 1,000,000 years," he said, "getting to the heart of how to paint." In his fantasies, he wanted to make life more colourful, more exciting, more adventurous, and it fitted in with his romantic view of the world.
Even on holiday, Churchill's thoughts were soon to return to world affairs. He was already preparing for his future mission, to warn the West of the ever-increasing Soviet threat to world peace.
It was, of course, a very big day in the history.
In March 1946, Churchill was invited by President Truman to speak at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. He used the opportunity to warn the Americans of the dangers of Soviet communism.
The new thinking was that the Soviets were taking a course of conduct that needed very close watching. And it was not dissimilar from some of the messages he had tried to give, but had been but little listened to during the run-up to World War II.
Whatever conclusions may be drawn from these facts, in fact they are, this is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up, nor is it one which contains the essentials of permanent peace.
Churchill urged an alliance between Britain and the United States as the only way to contain Soviet expansion. His speech was seen by many as inflammatory. He was again the warmonger, this time launching the Cold War. Undeterred, Churchill preached the same message in the countries of Western Europe, where he was celebrated as the conqueror of Nazi tyranny and the savior of Western civilization. In this chateau on Lake Geneva, he prepared the Zurich speech, setting out his vision of a united Europe.
I wish to speak to you today about the tragedy
of Churchill, who is the great victor of the war, who says, "You Europeans Don't desperate. Unite, and you'll be strong again. That is the idea. And it gave hope.
We must build a kind of United States of Europe. The first step in the recreation of the European family must be a partnership between France and Germany. There can be no revival of Europe without a spiritually great France and a spiritually great Germany. And therefore, I say to you, let Europe arise.
Churchill repeated his call for a reconciled and united Europe here in Amsterdam and in every Western capital.
And the new song, Europe Unite, was sung as he drove past on his way through the city.
We hope to see a Europe where men of every country will think as much of being a European as of belonging to their native land.
He'd spoken so eloquently about it all that people had got the wrong impression. His concept was Britain based on its world position, close ties with America, center of the great Commonwealth, and playing a major role, but not directly involved in Europe.
I don't think that Churchill really saw Europe in the sense that we were an equal partner with the other European countries. He was, after all, the head of what had just been a victorious country, faced with one country which had been defeated and the other one which had been occupied and then rescued. And I think there was a rather patronizing attitude shared by the British people towards the Europeans, a very great desire they should never do this again, never fight one another again. They should get together and sink the historic differences and all that kind of thing, but not that we should get too deeply into it.
The world stage held much of Churchill's attention as leader of the opposition. At home, he attacked Labour's nationalisation plans. Attlee's government was staggering from crisis to crisis. Churchill blamed socialism.
There are home fires smoking from Windermere to Woking, and we're not going to tighten our belts and miles.
If we sink to socialism, into moral and economic decline and collapse, not only will our own sufferings be intense, but we shall carry many other nations with us into chaos and communism.
In the wings was Churchill, waiting to do the maximum mischief to the national cause of economic recovery. And he was able to say to the people, which he did quite unscrupulously, all these economic difficulties are due to the socialist government. You know, socialist extravagance. And they're unnecessary. The hardships are unnecessary.
In opposition, Churchill had found it difficult to change, as he said, from a life of intense activity and responsibility to one where there was nothing to be looked for but anticlimax.
He was a rather intermittent opposition leader. He would make a great speech out in the House, all about the world. Remember the Fulton speech, for example, which in a way made history. And he'd make a great speech in the Commons. But the ordinary routine of opposition, asking of questions and so on, I think bored him to tears. He left that. He'd get a very strong team of very experienced people, and he left it to them. In fact, in the House of Commons, he was not an effective leader of opposition. Opposition is a very difficult and not very rewarding activity.
He wouldn't take any initiative. I remember him saying on one occasion, in a speech in the Commons, I think, what we want is 2 years of tranquility and peace. What he really meant was 2 years doing absolutely nothing.
We shall surely find the way under a faithful and tolerant government to those broad uplands where plenty, peace, and justice reign.
During his 5 years in opposition, Churchill often escaped to Chartwell to write his war memoirs, the first documented account of the Second World War, and the only account written by one of the big three. He sought the advice of specialists and worked with a small team of researchers.
He had to write a piece about the Blitz, you know, the German raid on London in 1940. And he got an expert to produce a brief of about 150 pages. And he said to me, we'll cut it down to 2.5 pages. And so I worked like stink, you see. I thought, produced about 2.5 pages. I thought it was quite good. And I sat beside him, and he took out his red pen and he started to correct. And all my sloppy sentences were tightened up and all my useless adjectives were obliterated. In the middle of it all, he said to me, very gently, I hope you don't mind my doing this. And I said, thank you, sir. You're giving me a free lesson in writing plain English.
The sales of Churchill's book were enormous. The 6 volumes earned him the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Writing a book is an adventure. To begin with, it is a toy and an amusement, and then it becomes a mistress, and then it becomes a master, and then it becomes a tyrant, and the last phase is that just as you are about to be reconciled to your servitude, you kill the monster.
During that dinner, he said to me, you know, 5 wasted years. He said, you and I, we've just been playing with the shadows of the past, writing history. I could have done so much if I'd been still in office.
At times like these, Churchill suffered from periods of deep depression. He called it his black dog.
I found myself sitting at mealtimes with Mr. Churchill and General Parnell, who was his advisor on the military side of the war memoirs. And General Parnell and I were having a light-hearted discussion on suicide, if such a thing is possible. And it seemed that Mr. Churchill was deep in his own thoughts and wasn't listening. And suddenly he jerked upright in his chair and shouted, "Stop it! You mustn't talk like that." He said, "It's not right." Once I almost thought of throwing myself under a train. Well, you can imagine, I mean, silence after that. There wasn't any conversation. Such a shock.
He said to his doctor that he didn't like staying in a hotel with balcony to the room in case he threw himself off, that he couldn't stand near the rail of a ship, that he couldn't stand near the edge of a railway platform, because there was a constant preoccupation with death and with the fear that a mood might suddenly overcome him and that he would throw himself off.
One of his consolations was his love of animals.
There was a time when he was being told that he should entertain more backbenchers at home, and shortly after the war, and one backbencher was put next to him and didn't quite understand that Winston wasn't really in the habit of talking a great deal until he got 1 or 2 warm courses of food into his tummy, and on this case particularly taciturn, when suddenly his first sign of life to this backbencher was a great lunge across the fellow, and he said, "Darling." But of course it was the cat who'd come into the room, and Winston felt, there's somebody I really love, and why am I having to put up with the backbencher?
I once went to see him when he was working in his bed during the morning. And there was Rufus, either Rufus I or Rufus II, lying across his ankles. There was the ginger cat, we had no other name for it, on his lap. And there was Toby the budgerigar sitting on his head. And here he was dictating away on some immensely important political document with a secretary behind him. And these three animals sort of hopping round him. Very moving.
Churchill loved watching films in his own cinema at Chartwell. His favourite actress was Vivien Leigh.
He invited Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh to lunch. I remember going into the dining room and seeing Vivien Leigh sitting beside Churchill at the table, and he was just looking at her, and he said to her, quite naturally, all I want is just to look at you. And you realize that he was spellbound by her beauty.
In February 1950, there was a general election. The Conservatives lost. Clementine had warned Churchill that as opposition leader he had not given of his best. She wrote, "I have felt chilled and discouraged by the creeping knowledge that you do only just as much as will keep you in power. But that much is not enough in these hard and anxious times." Within 18 months, there was another general election. Churchill's renewed energy and the changing mood of the country pointed this time to a change of government.
They made a night of it, sensing that a Conservative victory was on the way.
My mother viewed another term for him as Prime Minister and for her as the wife of the Prime Minister with misgiving. She felt that my father wasn't what he was. The strain of the war had been tremendous, and it took its toll. She accepted what the ballot box said with, I think, a sinking heart.
I changed in the middle of October, the end of October 1951, from being Private Secretary to Attlee to being Private Secretary to Churchill. And of course, for long after that, people had come up to me and said, "Tell me, there must be you must find a great difference between the two prime ministers." And I had a party piece already. I used to say, "Oh, yes, a tremendous difference. You can hardly imagine it. On the one hand, decisive, firm, quick, rapid. He will say, 'Very good, yes, certainly,' or 'no,' and so. And on the other hand, someone saying, 'Oh, I think I'll look at that a bit later,' or 'Wait till the weekend and I'll give you an answer,' or 'Bring it down to Chartwell.' Now, when I said Chartwell, you see, there would be a sort of double take, and all of a sudden they'd realise it was Churchill who was the chap who was keen on putting things off, and actually it was the man who was so decisive and quick about it.
Back in Downing Street, he assembled a new staff, but stuck to his old habits.
It'd be a call of, would one of the secretaries please come to the bathroom, you'll see, and you'd go and you'd identify yourself outside by a cough, and he'd say, "Don't come in," and you'd think to yourself, "No way, I don't want to go in." And you'd stand outside, and you'd hear these wonderful bathroom noises. You could sort of envisage the sponge being squeezed over the head, the sounds of water trickling down, and occasionally he'd call out, "Don't go away," and you'd say, "No, no, I'm still here." And the sounds of bathing would go on, and sometimes, you know, one really wasn't needed. He'd forgotten what he wanted to say.
And I was putting things on the table or something on his desk or something in the study, which was just outside his bedroom at Churchill, and a voice yelled out, "Miss, I'm coming out in a state of nature. You better watch it." And I fled as fast as I could because, well, there were some things one really...
We were all of us quite young girls at that time. There was no air of salaciousness and he would go into his bedroom, which was next door, and he would be wearing his siren suit for work. He always wore that with the zip up the front. And I was not allowed to. I was allowed to help him get it off his shoulders. And he would unzip it down to the waist and no further. And I would help him get it off, and then the rest he would do himself. He was so sweet. I remember one night he said to me, "You're very young. Are you 21?" And I wasn't. And he said, "When you're 21, I'll let you take the whole of my siren suit off."
In June 1953, the new Queen was crowned. Churchill, now Sir Winston, had been persuaded by the Queen to accept the knighthood of the Garter.
He'd been offered it in 1945, and he'd refused it with the words to the King, "I don't think that it's appropriate for me to accept the Order of the Garter from my sovereign when his people have just given me the Order of the Boot." So he didn't accept it the first time. He did the second time from the Queen.
Churchill's main concern as Prime Minister was the military might of Russia. His dream was to save mankind from a Third World War. His means, a summit of the Big Three. When Stalin died in 1953, it was to his successor Malenkov that Churchill turned.
He really believed that he had a mission. This I believe to be true. He had a mission to be as successful in peace as in war.
He had this illusion about our power in the world, or our potential power in the world, if we managed it properly. And he thought that he could talk to the Russians as equals and somehow persuade them to behave properly.
Winston's idea of a summit really was a meeting all alone with Malenkov, without officials and without agenda, he used to say. And this was thought a very dangerous thing by a lot of people. I think they were very much afraid that he might give things away which mustn't be given away, make concessions, weaken the resolution of the West, and upset our main ally.
Churchill went to see Eisenhower, the new President of the United States. They had fought together in the war. Churchill believed they could work together now to end the Cold War. By June 1953, Churchill had exhausted himself again. During a visit from the Italian Prime Minister, he was taken ill at a banquet in Downing Street.
When I went up to my father, I realized something was wrong. He was dazed and he was rather incoherent. And I'm afraid people who talked to him thought probably he'd had rather too much to drink. In fact, what had happened, he'd sustained a stroke.
Despite his stroke, Churchill held a cabinet meeting next morning. He was then driven to Chartwell.
The secret of the fact that he had had a major stroke was amazingly well kept. And the reason really for it was that my father walked unaided from the door at number 10 into his car. But by the time they got to Chartwell, he had to be carried out of the car. And then during the next few days, his stroke the effects of the stroke became much more marked, and he became practically helpless.
He was partially paralyzed. He couldn't use his left side. So his walking was very, very... In fact, he could hardly walk. His speech was slurred, but his brain was clear.
He recovered much quicker than what he thought. He had his stroke on the Wednesday. On the Friday, Lord Moran said to me that he didn't think he'd live over the weekend. But he started to make remarkable quick recovery.
Newspaper owners were summoned to Chartwell and agreed to keep the truth from the public.
I assumed, as everybody else did, that he would now resign from office. But then he said he would go on if he could recover sufficiently well to make a good speech to the Conservative Party conference at Margate in October.
We were all in the most frightful sweat. My mother longed for him to resign. I mean, to make this, excuse, it would have been comprehensible to all.
A few years ago, nationalization was among socialists.
Everybody was looking at him, particularly those of us who were in government and to some extent in the know, were looking at him rather more closely and perhaps than more ordinary. You couldn't detect a thing. He came through it triumphant. He made a very, very good speech.
If I stay on for the time being, bearing the burden at my age, it is not because of love for power or office. I have had an ample share of both. If I stay, it is because I have a feeling that I may, through things that have happened, have an influence on what I care about above all else, the building of a sure and lasting peace.
Churchill now redoubled his efforts to persuade Malenkov, the Russian leader, to agree to a summit.
Curiously enough, it failed because the Russians sent such rude answers to all his efforts. Not for the first time, we were saved by Russian obtuseness. They just brushed him off. Mind you, they were probably just as aware as we were of Britain's weak position, that we were bankrupt and all that, and that they didn't think it was such a big do to have the British Prime Minister. They were interested in the United States.
Churchill crossed the Atlantic again to press Eisenhower to hold a summit, but the Americans were no more interested than the Russians. He now reluctantly accepted that Britain's role had diminished in a world dominated by the two superpowers.
General Eisenhower is at the head of your country at the time when your country has been called upon to become the head of the world.
On his 80th birthday, Churchill was presented with a Graham Sutherland portrait by his former colleague and rival, Clement Attlee.
On behalf of both Houses of Parliament, Prime Minister, I ask you to accept this portrait.
When it came to the actual unveiling of the portrait, there was an audible gasp from the audience, and clearly it was quite a shock to my grandparents. And my grandfather, when he got up to reply, dealt with it in an absolutely brilliant manner.
The portrait is a remarkable example of modern art.
It was painted in sickly yellows and greens, and there was a hint of a fly button undone. And it was very sad, in fact, that such a splendid occasion should have been upset by this reaction.
The portrait was later destroyed by Lady Churchill.
My mother was perfectly dignified and simple. She said, I saw that it tormented your father, and I promised him that it would never see the light of day.
There were now rumblings from both party and cabinet that it was time for Churchill to step down. He was finding it more and more difficult to concentrate on the day-to-day business of government.
He certainly took less interest in detail and in matters that he didn't find particularly attractive than he had before, and he left much more power to other people.
They provided him with all the equipment, as it were, which they thought for his style of government he would need. And one of them was a great series of tags which they put on his desk, which he'd used greatly in 1940 to 45, which said, "Action this day." And this was put on a number of minutes which were sent out. and he never once used them in 1951 to 55. They lay there on the desk for a long time, but they were never used.
He was losing his grip and not really caring. I don't mean not caring in a nasty way, and of course he cared deeply for his country and so on. But he was just like an old man who'd had enough, I thought.
But Churchill was in no hurry to go, much to the frustration of Anthony Eden, wartime colleague and long-serving Foreign Secretary, who was the acknowledged Crown Prince.
Anthony was getting extremely impatient. He had been, as he thought, promised the prime ministership several times, and each time Churchill had found some reason not to go. One of the reasons being, I have to go and talk to the new rulers of Russia, you see.
He thought he was a better leader than his crown prince and didn't want to hand over. What was it he once muttered? I sometimes remind Anthony that Mr. Gladstone formed his last administration at the age of 81.
And thus make easier the discussions of all the difficult matters and events which will arise from month to month in the next few years.
Eden came to hate Churchill. And after the war, he hated him all the more for blocking him. I think there was great ill feeling between the two, of which probably Churchill was not so conscious. Or he put it at the back of his mind. Churchill simply wanted to stay as long as possible, because he thought that he'd be very lonely without the Boxers coming in every day.
He was really afraid of giving up because of the terrible depressions which always overtook him when he did cease to be busy and in the full flood of activity. I think Churchill found it impossible to give up so long as he was capable, in his own opinion, of carrying on.
I remember Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, coming up in the lift, and with very good cause, probably. He had been driven to the end of his tether by the interference from Downing Street in foreign affairs. And he would be saying, well, this time I will resign. This is resignation. And we would all sit on tenterhooks in the office. And the door would be shut. And 10 minutes later, the Foreign Secretary emerged, and he had not resigned.
They all wanted to push Winston out. They all saw he had several strokes, that he really ought to go, but none of them had the guts to go and say to him he should get out. The other thing it's difficult to understand is how the fact what a great man Churchill had been a few years before, and how this made him almost like a god. You didn't go and talk to gods in a rough way.
With the characteristic cigar clutched in his hand, the evergreen man of 80 years and 4 months sets out to tender his resignation to the young Queen.
In April 1955, after nearly 4 years in office, Churchill had finally decided to resign.
Those in bondage need never despair.
Over the next few years, the south of France became a second home for Churchill. He spent many weeks at a time staying at the Villa La Pausa, not far from Monte Carlo, as the guest of his publisher and literary advisor, Emery Reeves, and his American wife, Wendy.
Wendy had a wonderful sparkle. She would devote herself 100% to his needs. She was a charming conversationalist, and she looked after him in a most delightful way. Her nickname at one time was the Champagne Kitten. She was sort of enormously bubbly and charming and terribly fond of him and did everything to make him happy.
I could call him darling or monkey pie or you bad boy. I could tease him, you see, because I didn't really very often call him Sir Winston when he was here. I would say, good morning, darling, how are you this morning? Or I would say, are you hungry? You know, I could tease him. I could push him. I could pat him. I could shake him like... He liked it, you see? No one ever did that. He felt terribly loved here.
She mothered him. I remember once he was upset about something or other. Doesn't matter what it was, and she took his head in her arms and cradled him, and he adored it, just being spoilt.
He was so happy here that, as you know, he came back and came back and came back and came back. When he came the first time, he was to stay 10 days. He stayed 3 weeks. Each time he prolonged and prolonged until finally he was staying. The last 3 or 4 years he stayed more here than he stayed in England.
Tongues had begun to wag, not only behind people's backs. One day at luncheon, one of the women guests, seeing that Churchill appeared to have nodded off, remarked, "What a pity that such a great man should end his days in the company of Wendy Reeves." Suddenly one eye opened, and Churchill said, "Wendy is 3 things you will never be. She is young, she is beautiful, and she is kind." And then the eye closed. Inevitably, such gossip took its toll. Churchill's family had become unhappy with his long visits to the Reeveses.
The family concluded that it would be a good thing for him to have a break from that particular background, simply because he wasn't seeing so many of his old friends and themselves. The occasion for that was when he went on a first cruise on the Christina, on Onassis' yacht, where the Reeves were not included, and as he'd first met Onassis in their house, they were understandably rather hurt. Onassis had cabled me saying who should be the guests on this cruise, and there was a list of people, which I had to reply saying this is absolutely okay, but Lady Churchill suggests Wendy and Emery Reeves should not be included. There's a role, not a very agreeable role, I had to play of the surgeon, in a sense.
As Churchill grew older, his links with the past brought him happy and nostalgic moments. He would go to Harrow, his old school, for songs. He was still honoured as a world statesman. He was still a member of Parliament, returned by his faithful constituents in Epping. Frail though he was, he would go regularly to the Commons, listening to debates, but rarely speaking. In 1964, aged 89, Churchill finally retired. He had been a member of Parliament for more than 60 years.
I'd found him very unhappy and melancholy, and he was sitting after dinner and brooding. And I asked him why he was so melancholy. This was after his retirement, and pointed to his extraordinary achievements, both in politics, in the armed forces, having won the war. If you can put it down to a single man, it was he. Of course you can't. And things like the Nobel Prize for Literature, a large family, all loved him. And with all that, he was popular. I said he'd had a life that was given to very few people. Why was he so gloomy? And he said this, yes, you're right. I have worked very hard all my life, and I have achieved a great deal, in the end, to achieve nothing. And what he meant was that his ideals, if they could be summed up, was a strong and united British Empire and Commonwealth in a totally peaceful world.
Of Churchill's last year, his daughter Mary wrote, "The pace of his life was like a broad, weary river, gently meandering on. Sometimes he withdrew a great distance from us, and who knows what thoughts or images moved across the screen of his consciousness from the long saga of his life."
Because he said he didn't like old age. Old age is intolerable. Oh, yes, I think he was very sad. Fortunately, his eyesight was very good, and he was able to read. He read Hornblower and that sort of thing, which he enjoyed enormously.
I went to lunch with him, and we lunched alone. We lunched in the garden, and he was in a sort of reminiscing mood about things and happenings and he said to me, "I have done my bit. I should be allowed to depart in peace." And it was terrible because you realized that, you know, there was nothing anymore that he could do, therefore he didn't want to go on. The end was not the greatest time for him.
In January 1965, Churchill suffered a massive stroke and went into a coma. The crowds gathered for news outside his home in Hyde Park Gate in London.
I chiefly remember the great sort of stillness in our house and the throng of people outside, totally quiet crowd, but a very sad one, and also the feeling as the days went by that in a way the whole world seemed to be with us. And inside the house it was very peaceful. My father just really faded away over a series of days. He became deeply unconscious. And yet I know that until a very short time before his death, the nurses always used to tell me that they knew that he knew when my mother was sitting by his side. And she used to sit there for hours by his bed, holding his hand. It was a very peaceful scene, really. He had a dear orange kitten, which was fairly new acquisition, and that used to lie curled up on his bed, and we used to come in and out, and the grandchildren came up to say their goodbyes. My children were rather small, but I'm glad they saw him looking so peaceful, and one of them said to me, "I don't think I shall ever be frightened of death." And then he died about 8 o'clock on Sunday, the 24th of January, 1965.
Approaching the west door, I saw an enormous marble plaque on the floor, and on it the legend, "Remember Winston Churchill." I thought to myself, how could anyone forget him? The man who not only saved Britain, but really saved the whole world from Nazi domination.
Michel? And I
Hold it.
It's ironic that now, 28 years after his death, Churchill's dream of a united Europe is finally coming to pass. Germany and England, the great adversaries of his time, are linked, and even the Russians may one day join the European community as members. In a way, they all owe a debt to Winston Churchill. I'm Peter Graves for A&E. Until next time on Biography.